Hello, listeners past, present, and future. This is Haddonfield Radio, where, as always, we bring you the history, legacy, and lore of movies, trailers, and more. This season, we will be joining you for a deep dive fan commentary journey through every single film in the Friday the 13th franchise, featuring everybody's favorite vengeful vessel of violence, Jason Voorhees. My name, as always, is Christian White.
And I'm Joe Francazio.
Jason, don't you remember? Jason.
There are stories that are told again and again by campers huddled around campfires. A time-honored tradition of well-tread tall tales meant to pass the hours through the long, dark nights. There are also stories that chill the blood of those unlucky enough to hear them. Stories that seem to make the nights somehow both longer and darker. One of these is the story of the Lake Bodom massacre. It was the halcyon summer of 1960 in Northern Europe. The restrictive mores of the post-war 1950s had given way to an almost immediately freer social atmosphere nearly the instant the 1960s dawned across a planet still reeling from a catastrophic world war less than 2 decades before. Yet nowhere in the world could you find a more unanimously peaceful area than the region of Espoo in Finland, and its own crown jewel was the pristine, curling waterfronts of Lake Bodom. Located mere miles outside of progressive Helsinki, and bordering some of the most primeval forested regions that Nordic Europe has to offer, Lake Bodom was a popular camping retreat, its tony coastline dotted with the summer homes of the wealthy and privileged. On the evening of June 4th, 4 friends, 2 girls and 2 boys, 2 teenaged couples to be exact, arrived on the welcoming shores of Lake Bodom for a romantic night of camping and fun. After a cozy fireside dinner, the lulling campfire led both of the young couples to become romantically entwined. The night was calm. A cool breeze caused the campfire to pop and sizzle as a chorus of crickets warbled while the trees swayed dreamily. The couples chose this spot knowing that they were presumably alone, for miles perhaps, so the 4 teens felt free and without inhibition. Little did they know, they were not alone, and they were being watched. A lone stranger lay in wait in the near darkness, mere feet from them, yet safely obscured by the density of the bordering forest canopy. Sometime around 2 a.m., as the campfire began to ebb, one of the boys kicked sand over what remained of the smoldering embers, and the 4 teens retired together to their single tent. Sometime between 4 and 6 a.m., 2 full hours later, the teens were sleeping soundly inside of their tent as night crept towards dawn. Desperate to assuage his psychotic desire for young blood, the stranger approached the tent, lit coolly by the white light of the full summer moon. The stranger was armed with a large hunting knife in one hand and a blunt instrument in the other, described as either a boulder or hammer. Suddenly, from outside, and with a reckless abandon, the killer began to savage the tent and its helpless occupants trapped inside. He monstrously smashed at the skulls of the 2 boys, then turned to wildly slashing and stabbing both of the defenseless girls. Once he was sure the 4 teenagers were good and dead, the stranger relented back into the dark embrace of the night. Hours later, a local carpenter on an otherwise normal morning hike happened upon the collapsed tent and discovered nothing short of a bloodbath. The 2 female victims, both aged only 18 years, were absolutely mutilated by the unforgiving blade of the bloodthirsty killer. Both of the boys suffered horrifying injuries due to blunt force trauma. One of the two boys, only 16 years old, had his head and face smashed to a steaming pulp that was well beyond recognition. The other young man was unimaginably injured, yet he actually survived. And even more disturbingly, he awoke only moments before the attack began and was able to witness a glimpse of the barbaric maniac. The young man described a tall, dark figure wearing black, clad in a mask that only revealed what he chillingly described as a pair of bright red eyes that appeared to glow along with his homicidal rage. In a possible case of art imitating life, over the ensuing decade since its release, many fans of the 1980 classic Friday the 13th have speculated that perhaps either the film's director Sean S. Cunningham or screenwriter Victor Miller may have in fact been partly inspired by the heinous events forever known as the Lake Bodom massacre. The pieces certainly fit. An idyllic campground set against a tranquil lake, a group of unsuspecting young campers and lovers, a lone, devious killer hidden in the inky darkness, watching and waiting until striking, leaving one final survivor. An argument for inspiration can certainly be made. And yet, just as art can often imitate life, the inverse can also be true. Sometimes life imitates art. Thinking back on the horrors faced by the 4 victims, 3 of whom brutally lost their young lives on the shores of Lake Bodom, you are forced to consider a terrifying thought.
Imagine for a moment if the art your life is imitating is anything like Friday the 13th.
By 1984, the Friday the 13th film series had confidently climbed to the very top of the horror heyday dogpile, both in terms of fan appeal and box office supremacy. The Friday films had been shepherded by Hollywood studio executive Frank Mancuso Sr., who began his industrious career in the movie business as a lowly theater usher in Buffalo, New York at the age of 16. By 1984, Mancuso Sr. had combined his highly profitable acumen as the guiding force for the Friday the 13th films, as well as his storied career as a longtime studio executive, into his new role as president of Paramount Pictures, the very studio which had successfully distributed all of the films in his Friday series thus far. Mancuso Sr. had also cultured his own son, Frank Mancuso Jr., from a production assistant on Friday Part 2 all the way to becoming one of the principal producers for both Part 3 and the soon-to-be-released 4th and so-called final chapter of the Friday the 13th franchise. The Mancusos had dominated the domestic box office with the first 3 films in the Friday series, while maintaining highly pragmatic and frugal budgets. For the first 3 Friday films, the Mancusos spent less than a mere $5 million in total, including production costs and marketing for all 3 films. In turn, and quite amazingly, the first 3 Friday films grossed nearly $100 million combined. An astonishing result for the horror genre at that, or really any time. Consider that, as 1984 dawned, Michael Myers was recovering from extreme burns on life support at Ridgemont Hospital somewhere outside of Haddonfield, Leatherface's feared chainsaw had seemingly run out of gas, and the Dream Demon himself, Freddy Krueger, was just getting started. So, aside from a few last-ditch imitators, like 1981's Happy Birthday to Me and 1983's Sleepaway Camp, by the time the final chapter was unleashed, Jason Voorhees essentially had the auspicious pleasure of being the biggest and baddest shark in the blood-soaked seas of early 80s slasher cinema. Yet while ravenous fans of the Friday series seemed more than satiated by the first 3 films and were clearly primed for more, Friday producer Frank Mancuso Jr. had begun to openly admit to a touch of series malaise, feeling chained to the pop cultural behemoth that the Friday films had become. The Friday films had also become a hard target for both the Motion Picture Association of America, as well as the media, whose continued scrutiny of the series' perceived vulgarity of violence had been seen as an open embarrassment for many of the studio executives at Paramount Pictures. Yet, unsurprisingly, no one at either Paramount or its parent company, Gulf and Western, were heard complaining about the massive influx of box office the Mancusos and the Friday films had proudly earned for the company. So with that, a conservative $2.2 million budget for the 4th film was set, and pre-production on the final chapter began in earnest. To helm the 4th Friday, the Mancusos offered the director's chair to the obvious choice, Parts 2 and 3 director Steve Miner. But Miner, not unlike Mancuso Jr., had become admittedly a bit bored of the series, and felt exhausted after directing Part 3's complicated 3D production. In a pinch, the production turned to Friday 1 and 2 producer and co-financier Phil Scuderi, who immediately recommended experienced horror and exploitation director Joseph Zito for the job. Joseph Zito, a soft-spoken but highly driven New York filmmaker, had directed both Abduction and Blood Rage in the late 70s to decent drive-in acclaim. Zito, uncomfortable with writing the 4th Friday script himself, brought aboard screenwriter Bruce Hidemi Sakau to break the general story beats and kills for the 4th film, while co-writer Barney Cohen was also hired on to further develop the characters and family dynamic of the film. To create the final chapter's explosive gore and special makeup effects, the production brought on the highly respected artist and sculptor Greg Canham, whose work on films such as The Fury, The Howling, and the music video for Michael Jackson's Thriller spoke for itself. However, director Joseph Zito specifically instructed Canham to design this version of Jason Voorhees' look to be an evolution of the original sculpt that Tom Savini had created for actor Ari Lehman to wear in the first film's iconic stinger ending. Canham bristled against Zito's order, fairly desiring the opportunity to execute his own vision, and a compromise could not be met. Zito had successfully previously collaborated with the infamous Sultan of Splatter, Tom Savini, on Zito's highly underrated 1981 slasher film The Prowler, so the idea arose to replace Canham with the man himself. Tom Savini developed a deeply passionate interest in makeup and special effects at the tender age of 12, when he first witnessed Lon Chaney's mesmerizing self-applied effects transformations on a tiny black and white television back in the Pittsburgh of his childhood. To have the chance to, quote, kill the monster he created was too good of a chance for Savini to pass up. The already legendary Savini was joined by an expanding entourage of some of special effects' rising stars, such as John Vulich, Savini's protege and head assistant at the time, and the dynamic combined talents of Alec Gillis and Kevin Yeager. Already on the final chapter set when Savini arrived were also notable returning Friday effects artists Jim Cagle and Larry Carr. Finally, Jason's newly iconic hockey mask found its next steward, as 57-year-old Ted White, a career Hollywood stuntman who doubled for movie legends like Clark Gable and John Wayne, was cast to portray the so-called final incarnation of Jason Voorhees. White matched Part 3's Richard Brooker with what many would call an equally visceral physical intensity, while mining new levels of cunning that further evolved and deepened Jason's psychotic motivations. Finally, on Friday, April 13th, 1984, Friday the 13th, the final chapter, opened across the country to an explosive, record-breaking opening weekend of nearly $12 million, shattering all of Paramount's previous box office records straight out of the gate. There is still so much more for us to deep dive into, as the final chapter remains considered by many fans, myself included, as arguably the greatest of all the Friday sequels. Yet, is it? This was a profoundly difficult shoot, and the film has had a much more complicated behind-the-scenes story than you might remember. Our journey through the Friday the 13th franchise continues here with this, the epic culmination of a frenetic 4 years and 4 Friday films. This is the history, legacy, and lore of Joseph Zito's 1984 slasher sequel, Friday the 13th, the final chapter. And Joe, here we are, 26 episodes into Haddonfield Radio, and I bet you by this point can almost guess the question I'm about to ask you. Can you guess it?
I think I know where you're going.
What do you think I'm about to ask you to answer? What do you think the world, the literal world right now is waiting for you to answer?
What I had for breakfast, right?
What did you eat this morning before so that you could have a healthy recording session?
Actually, to be serious, I knew you were... This is obviously where we start every episode, where I come in and have to tell you what I think, and I have waffled back and forth so many times into how I was going to answer this, to the point where I still don't know. I think I was just waiting for it to happen. This movie...
Well, here, you're on the spot now.
I know.
What do you
I
think
love
of it? What do you think generally?
I love it. It's a great film. I will only say that I don't have that beloved feeling. I think a lot of the fans think this is sort of the penultimate or one of the best Fridays.
Well, it's interesting that it is widely... It seems to be widely considered that way.
I was surprised by that, actually, as I was doing my research. Not that I think it's bad in any way. Like, it's another Friday the 13th movie for me. I think it might have carried more weight if, like a lot of these franchises that have, a lot of movies, there's usually that sort of like unofficial trilogy somewhere in the middle of one of these franchises. And so obviously they were starting, or this leads to this idea of the Tommy Jarvis
kind of
trilogy.
The Tommy Jarvis era.
And I think this would have held more weight if they continued it in the way that Zito and Feldman and them sort of actually set up for at the end of this movie. And it doesn't quite...
Isn't it interesting
go there.
How much it may... I didn't really realize this connection until I was watching the final chapter this month to prepare for this episode. But what really struck me about the ending, especially the final shot of this film that you were just mentioning, is how much... whether it's coincidental or a ripoff, now that I think of it, the ending of Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers, absolutely mimics this ending, where Danielle Harris's character is clearly demented by the end of the film. And you're left thinking, well, here we go. Now, Danielle Harris is going to continue on in the Michael Myers mold. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and they also
you feel that way about Tommy Jarvis in this film.
But they both don't really continue.
Neither of them do
in that sort of way, right?
No, it's interesting.
And yeah, it is. It is interesting. I mean,
Did you think of that Halloween 4 ending yourself?
I didn't. No, I didn't.
Oh, so you didn't see that connection?
Well, Halloween 4 came out after
It came out much after this. What I'm suggesting is that perhaps the ending of Halloween 4 may have been somehow inspired by the ending of Friday 4.
I think it's also probably a natural evolution in the story once you start to introduce a child to these slasher films.
Yeah,
so that was a big change for this movie, was that we have not only a child introduced, but by the time we get to the end of the film, we are left with more than just the final girl. We have a child survived as well.
Exactly.
And so we have, the first time we have 2 survivors. Yeah, this whole movie, the production, everything, there's so much to talk about. It's got one of those, I love, great stories behind the making of movies, and this is, of course,
this is a doozy.
Yeah.
This movie. This movie had a complicated, turbulent production.
And you brought up Steve Miner earlier, and I thought it was interesting when I was doing my research that I saw a quote by him when he was talking about turning it down, and he said, very pointedly, I believe, that the success of Friday the 13th movies rely on making the same movie over and over and over again, and he
which is a fair
didn't want to just keep doing that.
It's
you know
a fair
what I mean?
Point.
It's not wrong. I mean, it's why we love these movies. We know we're going to see young people get murdered, and Jason and everything he does,
A couple interesting things I was mentioning to Joe before we started recording, relating to Steve Miner.
Yeah.
I have read numerous accounts and numerous quotes from Steve Miner where he was basically talking about how he was exhausted after Part 3 because of the technical requirements for the 3D production. And yet, I found it very strange and ironic that at this exact time that he's being offered the chance to direct Friday 4 and complete what would have been his own trilogy, unofficial trilogy with, like you were just mentioning, he was actually trying to convince the legendary Japanese company Toho that owns Godzilla to allow him to direct a American version of Godzilla, and strangely enough, it would have been presented in 3D.
Sure.
So,
and if you're going to make a 3D movie at that point, you're going to go with somebody who was successful at it, right?
Friday 3 most definitely proved the tried and true notion that, at least at that time, and I guess even into this era of the 2020s, 3D does bring people into the movie theater.
Yeah.
And if you look at Friday Part 2's box office, it leveled out a little over $20 million, which was about 50%, or I think even less than that, of what the first film made. The first film was like a massive success. The second film wasn't as much of a success, but it was enough of a success relative to its budget to continue to a third film. The third film doubles that box office to almost 40 million, and you can attribute a lot of that success to the gimmick of 3D. So I can see why Steve Miner would be at once exhausted by the physicality of 3D, but still looking at it as a potential for other films in the future.
Yeah.
But I think Joseph Zito ultimately actually was the perfect guy at that time to direct this movie. And yet, boy, did he have a rough go of it while he was on this set.
Yeah. There was a lot of challenges for him. I mean, coming into established franchise where certain things were expected. Start with the beginning of the movie. That whole montage in the beginning, like, boy, did he not want to have that there.
And you know who directed that montage?
Who?
Was not Joseph Zito.
No, I know.
It was actually Frank Mancuso Jr.
Yeah, I mean, even the editor, there's a nice commentary track on the Scream Factory set with Zito and the editor and the writer, and they talk about they see the film and they're like, what is this?
Yeah,
in the beginning,
right.
The editor had no part in it, and and they just seeing.
I've read literally that Frank Mancuso Jr. literally put that montage together himself.
Oh yeah, I bet he did. And Zito also shouldn't be too surprised. All the other movies started with a sort of catch.
Yeah, it became almost part of the tradition of the first 4 films. See, look, I think it's so important to just stop here for a quick second and just discuss one quick thing. As I was mentioning in episode 23, which was the season 3 premiere. I see the Friday 13th franchise really in two separate eras. You have the first era, in my opinion, which starts with Friday 1980, the first film, and ends right here with the final chapter of 1984. Those first 4 films, in my opinion, is one era of Jason Voorhees' story. I call it the life of Jason Voorhees, because that's really what it represents, as complicated as that actually is when you break it down, the idea of his life. He's come back from the dead at least twice already, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So, then you have this bridge of Part 5, and I cannot wait for the next episode because I have this perception of Part 5 as a bridge between these two eras, as a specific kind of movie that makes it placed perfectly within the Friday franchise, where a lot of fans sort of dispute Part 5 or dismiss Part 5 for some obvious reasons that we'll get to next episode.
Yeah.
But I think it's an amazing bridge between these two eras. Then the second era begins with Part 6, Jason Lives, and goes up through Jason X. Now, as I said in episode 23, things get a little fuzzy and dicey during Jason Goes to Hell. The mythology gets a little odd during that movie. We can all accept that.
Yeah.
But for the sake of argument, from Part 6 to Part Jason X, I call that the living death of Jason Voorhees. That's the second era of his life, where he comes back again as some form of revenant to continue his vengeful pursuit of violence and his own form of justice and protecting his woods and whatever you want to call it.
He becomes supernatural.
He becomes a supernatural figure. I think you could make the argument safely that he kind of is a supernatural figure from the very beginning, considering the fact that he's supposedly dead in the first movie.
But
the whole agency of Pamela Voorhees' character in the first movie stems from the fact that her son, Jason Voorhees, is dead. Yet here he is in Part 2 as an adult male, so he is alive.
So it's like
There's a chasm of disbelief there.
Those first few movies, they don't worry about giving any sort of explanation behind why he just keeps staying alive.
Right.
Besides,
which I think is smart.
Something scary about that. And then from 6 on, they clearly show you him being resurrected, that he was dead. It's a little more thought out. You don't have to question it. But it is weird. Like even this one, he's just still alive. You know what I mean? There's nothing that happens that brings him back, or it's just he didn't die of getting an axe to his head.
It's like, as we've discussed in length in the past few episodes, he also is quite supernaturally, like you're just saying, able to survive what should be mortal injuries.
Now, what's interesting, though, from the producer's standpoint, they make Part 3, they end it again, saying, we're killing Jason here. Everyone made that movie thinking Jason is being killed here. Yet, Mancuso still then says, okay, we need to make another one and actually kill him off, which is, I know from his personal reasons was sort of that, he wasn't getting the respect he thought he should as a producer, even though they were making crazy money, that everyone still scoffed that it was slasher movies and it was not much.
And his own father was literally running the studio.
Right. So he's like, all right, I gotta just kill this thing off. It's sort of dying out anyway, even though it kind of wasn't, because Freddy's just starting. But anyway, so he's like, we're gonna actually kill him off. I just find that the whole thing weird, since they did already do it. Why not just leave him dead?
Because I think the distinction between the third and fourth films is the third film, it was a quiet notion of this may well be the end of the series. When it was a massive success relative to its budget, because primarily of the 3D gimmickry, and they realized they ostensibly could continue on, the notion grew to become, let's create a marketing arena around the idea of Jason's going to be dead. Yeah. We're going to kill off this incredible character, and this is going to be your final chance to experience one of these movies in the movie theater.
It's the gimmick.
Look,
I get
from
it.
Going even further through the franchise's history, from a 2025 perspective, where we are for our listeners in the past, present, and future, where we are right now, the Friday the 13th franchise has really had more farewell tours than Kiss.
Yeah.
I mean, the Friday franchise has utilized the idea of finality to great financial aplomb time and time again. It's become part of almost the DNA of this franchise.
I was saying to you the other day, it's kind of... I would never advocate for this for a lot of movies, but I feel like certain franchises like this, where they really thought they were killing off characters at times, but then it goes on to do many more movies. It's too bad you couldn't retroactively sort of retitle some of these movies once the whole franchise is kind of finished up, so that they kind of all fit together and you don't have all these titles that imply that we're ending this thing, and then there's 5 more movies after it.
Yeah, so you're saying from
I'm just saying, like, I don't know. It's
like
I know
retroactively,
it's right? It's the one thing that bugs me, because you do have this beautiful
I don't think
catalog.
It doesn't bother me at all.
Yeah.
I love the actual design. I have to say this, just to respond to what you're just saying. I think one thing that has really occurred to me while doing season 3 here and really deep diving into all of these movies, even after all these years that I've been aware of them and have watched them and have been a fan of them, I've become so much more of a fan, really, of the overall design of the entire franchise. And I think it's because I've come to terms, like I was just talking about, with how I personally see these movies and how I personally see both the mythology and the narrative through line of all of these movies. I think the Friday the 13th franchise actually has the clearest through line that follows through all of the films of any of the major horror franchises. Nightmare on Elm Street changes in both almost like tone, the mythology, and especially as we've discussed last season, the rules certainly are bent, if not broken, numerous times. The Halloween franchise, while Michael Myers stays incredibly static, it's gone in some wild, strange directions over the years. Yeah. But the Friday the 13th franchise has stayed fairly relatable and dependable, and you could count that as a negative or a positive.
No, they do all do some things differently, but in Friday 13th definitely seems to embrace some ideas on a franchise level that the others don't. They understand what they are, and they just sort of keep trying to give you more of that.
But you're right, like you were saying earlier, if you stop within this franchise and start asking any logic questions at any point, the entire house of cards falls down. Yeah. And I'm not saying that to be an asshole or to be, to denote some sort of negativity towards the franchise. Yeah. I just think, like you were saying earlier, you sort of have to embrace these films with a heightened suspension of disbelief, both in terms of the timelines that are presented within the storylines, and even the mythology and the evolutions of the mythology. You're sort of you either have to be strapped in and along for the ride, or this might not be for you.
Yeah, no, you have to just be willing to have more fun with these.
If you're too much of a critical thinker,
exactly.
These movies are probably going to be annoying to you.
Speaking of critical thinking, you had pointed out not too long ago, you're like, hey, make sure you go watch the Siskel and Ebert reviews.
Oh my, I can't, I'm so glad you brought let's get into that.
Oh my God.
Because it's actually, that's actually an iconic review of Siskel and Ebert.
So to our listeners right now, if you have to, pause the episode right now, go look up the Siskel and Ebert review for
the final chapter.
The final chapter. It's only like 5 minutes, and then come back and finish, because you have to listen to the pure venom and hatred that these two guys had for this movie. And I think it's interesting that Ebert, he seemed to have from the first movie to part 4, he became much more critical of it.
Okay, tell me if I'm wrong here. When I was watching on YouTube that exact Siskel and Ebert review of Friday the 13th, the final chapter, one aspect of the review, especially from Roger Ebert's side, that really captured my attention was it was less of a review of the final chapter, Joseph Zito's 1984 movie, than it was a total and complete recrimination of the entire slasher subgenre that finally by 1984, to detractors' mindset, was reaching declining popularity. So it was like, you can kick it while it's down.
Sort of. I mean, but still look at the money the good ones will make.
Like I said in my intro, the Friday the 13th movies were still stalwart in their box office potential. Yeah. But the slasher subgenre as a whole, by 1984, objectively had cooled a bit.
But then you also, like I said, we're just about to get Freddy, so it lingers on.
Which absolutely is true.
What these guys, just totally forget is films are they're part of our entertainment system in this world. They're entertainment.
Yeah, that's exactly
right.
And
people were being entertained by them. So you can, yes, of course, you can try and nitpick it and go on about messages, and Ebert's worried about how the youth.
I hate that argument.
How what you're saying to the youth that the world is just out to kill you.
Video games are going to make you demented. Movies are going to make you demented. I absolutely despise that thinking.
And Siskel was stuck on the idea that all we're showing is that men want to hurt women on film,
exactly.
Right?
Siskel's idea that the slasher films are some sort of assault on the women's liberation movement, which is so ridiculous. It's patently ridiculous.
And you can have these arguments. People, you can go down these roads, and
you're certainly free to.
The subtext is there, maybe not, but the way they were so mad that these movies even existed, when clearly there was an audience for it.
A large
shows
audience.
how ridiculous it was that these were two film critics that we listened to for so long. They just don't get it. They were taking it too seriously.
Well, here's the thing, though, that has to be said. Especially if you're listening to this episode and you are right now in 2025 under the age of 30. You have to understand that before the internet, and before every single person had a voice that could be listened to, if you wanted to know if a movie was worth seeing or not, you simply checked whether Siskel and Ebert gave it a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Those two opposable thumbs could literally sink or float a movie, period.
But and it's
they were the gatekeepers of the movie industry in terms of what the public was willing to consume to a great, I'm talking like very seriously. Yeah. Like I'm not even. You can attest to this. I'm not exaggerating.
They were everywhere. They, besides their own show, they would show up on other shows. It's who you went to. Them and the dude who did the morning shows with the
Gene Shalit.
Yeah,
certainly there were other very very
they
well-known.
They were the rock stars, though, of the film critic world.
And mainly it's because most of the other mainstream critics like Pauline Kael or people like that, you would read their reviews in the newspaper. Siskel and Ebert were on national television.
And people liked them because they argued. That's argued.
Exactly right.
That was the thing. They rarely saw eye to eye.
They were two Chicago-based print movie critic journalists who ended up hosting a TV show together that became literally an iconic, essentially review system for American cinema.
But, they're yelling things like, the filmmakers of Final Chapter should be ashamed of themselves and all this stuff. Come on, they made a movie that made a ton of money. I mean, what is there to be ashamed of?
My dad always has said this saying, there's an ass for every seat.
Yeah.
And I think it's exactly like what you were mentioning a minute ago. Something that especially Roger Ebert just misses the boat on with these films in his scorched earth review of the final chapter, which I want to say I think is wholly unfair. You can say what you want. Listen, if you put the final chapter up against Chariots of Fire, okay, you know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, well,
here.
that's what I mean.
But there's an ass for every seat.
Yeah.
For every movie is somebody's favorite movie, and you know what? I think the final chapter is actually a pretty damn well-made film for what it was, for the money that was spent, in the atmosphere for which it was created, or by which it was created.
They were using this film to be able to...
I'm talking objectively.
Yeah, they were using it to air their grievances on the whole slasher genre.
Exactly.
And I think they were actually made a little more mad because they weren't allowed... Paramount wouldn't let them use footage of the movie in their review, which they took as Paramount being so embarrassed.
Do you have any idea as to why Paramount would not have wanted footage available to reviewers? Why would they not want clips available?
I just don't know where in the release this, their review is coming out. So if it's early on, they probably just don't want people. They don't want spoilers. Probably.
Okay, yeah, you're right. I get that. It's a good enough explanation as any.
Or they know that Siskel and Ebert are going to rip them apart, and like they have over the years, and they're not going to do them any favors.
Well,
clearly,
just looking at the Friday the 13th films, they had a sort of like review armor around them. Because no matter what, by the fourth film in this series, I think the Mancusos were more than certain that they had a predictable audience that was going to show up. Mm-hmm. I don't think they expected it to be as big as it was, especially, I want to really make it clear how kind of ostentatious that opening weekend for the final chapter was, at almost $12 million. That may not sound like a triumphant opening weekend right now in 2025, but at the time, not only was that the biggest opening weekend in horror history, it was the biggest opening weekend in the history of Paramount Pictures.
Yeah.
Not just for the Friday films or horror films, total.
Yeah.
So
now,
people showed up.
There's a little truth to the fact that Paramount wasn't exactly, flaunting that this was under their banner. You know what I mean? The slasher genre definitely had a sort of reputation, and they didn't want to totally embrace it. But yet, it made a lot of money for them, so they did what they had to. Let's put it that way. You know what I'm saying? And not much more.
Exactly.
Although on this film, even though they were still the distribution company, this was the first Friday film that Paramount played an active role in post-production. This movie had like a scheduled release for October, and then
which
suddenly they changed it to April,
which gave them a Friday the 13th weekend as well.
But what meant is that basically, like Joseph Zito, the editors, Mancuso Jr., they just locked themselves in this like house to get the film edited super quick. And Paramount paid for all this to happen. They had food sent to them. They paid for the house. They helped make sure that they could deliver it on time. And that's the first time Paramount has actually kind of done anything more than just distribute the film.
Well, how weird is it when you really stop to think about the fact that, as we talked about last episodes, the Friday franchise was really like a family business, much like the Accads and the Halloween franchise. The Mancusos, for the first era of this franchise, were really the driving force behind these films. And at that time, 1984, Frank Mancuso Sr. is literally the president of Paramount Pictures that is releasing this film. Yeah. And yet, he still applied an incredibly restrictive and frugal $2 million budget. Sure. Whereas he was the top decision maker of that studio. He could have given his own family's film, quote unquote, an edge, but he still maintained a very frugal spending and thrifty spending mentality.
Well, that's what made these movies worthwhile for Paramount to do.
That's exactly right.
It
was a brilliant economic move by both Frank Mancuso Sr. and Jr. to keep these films at a cost minimum to maximize the amount of potential profit. And it's something that producers like Jason Blum of Blumhouse nowadays has made a literal career out of.
Right.
Jason Blum has made an entire movie studio based on this philosophy that I would argue really came from Frank Mancuso Sr.
Yeah.
and Jr.
Yeah, totally.
It's funny, really quick.
Yeah.
Speaking on Frank Mancuso Jr., when you're looking at the final chapter's history and legacy and lore, you constantly come up against this wall where Frank Mancuso Jr. was apparently quite objectively unhappy.
Right. Yeah.
He felt, like you said, he was chained to this franchise.
And no matter how much money it made, like, he just couldn't get respect as a producer.
And he wanted to do other things. He had other ideas as a filmmaker and as a producer that he wanted to do, especially while his father was running a major, if not the most major studio in Hollywood. And yet, I would argue that of all of these films, this is the one where Frank Mancuso Jr., I think, really contributes the most positive things. I think he was at his best as a producer on this film. And I think for the complicated production that it was that we're going to discuss as we go on, I think he did an incredible job for being a very young man at the time in corralling what was a complicated production. Also, it is a movie in and of itself. It's just the final chapter, but it is also the culmination of four other,
Right.
It's the fourth of, it's a fourth movie in a series.
Well, and that's what a lot of its promotions was around the voiceover, and on the posters it would say 3 times before.
That's right. And I love that marketing.
Yeah.
And really quick, isn't that another thing that the Friday franchise does so well in these first 4 films? The marketing of these films it's so elegant, and I know that might not sound like the appropriate word to describe the marketing for a slasher series, but it's beautifully branded.
Yeah.
It's elegantly designed.
Well,
all the trailers sort of work in concert with each other. It feels like a continuing series without making you feel lost if you came in on the third film.
It's in a way it's sort of just a very bare bones thing, because again, to keep in their model of making money, not spending too much on promoting, like a lot, there's never, at least for these early films, I don't know if it continues, but there's no teasers, then a trailer. It's just, there's only one trailer.
And was that the case for all 4 of these first 4 movies?
Up until the first 4, there's just sort of the one main trailer.
Love that.
And then like on TV commercials, it would be, different ways of cutting up that same trailer, but it was still the same type of voiceover, the same stuff.
And I love how the trailers would continually sort of get you up to speed, just like we were talking about these what became these patented montages at the beginning of each film that gets the audience up to speed, reminds you where you left off, or if you didn't see the last film, it gives you enough that you can still enjoy this film.
And most of them focus on the number of kills. Like those first few trailers, they're actually on the screen come the numbers 1, 2.
I love
that. They show each death, and then even this one they may not focus on it, but they give you. There's always the montage of all the deaths. You know what I mean?
Yeah, right.
So that there's a lot of killing. And this movie had, at least up until this point, has the most amount of gore and nudity than any of the other previous 3.
This is definitely catching up with this film to create this episode. This is definitely the bawdiest of the first 4 Friday films.
Yeah.
I was actually surprised at the level of nudity, sexuality, and of course and we're going to get into this right now, and I'm so excited to talk about this. I think due to the insane lineup of literal genius special effects talent that was on board this film, you get some show-stopping kills in the final chapter. Can we just talk for a minute about some of the artists who they got together for this film? Do you mind if we jump in on that for a second?
No.
First off, I want to jump in on one of the guys that I've literally been a fan of 3/4 of my entire life, and that's Kevin Yeager.
Yeah.
Kevin Yeager, as far as I can tell, this was really his first major job. Mm-hmm. And he was part of Savini's, I would call entourage of talent at that time, Savini's stable. I think the funny thing about the lore regarding the special effects of the final chapter is very simplistic if you hear about it from a distance. This is the movie where Savini came back and returned to the Friday fold to bring his incredible genius special effects back to the Friday franchise. That is absolutely true. But it seems to me that Savini was much more of almost like a mentor figure on this set for a number of hungry, younger, upstart artists like Kevin Yeager, Alec Gillis, who later went on to co-create Amalgamated Dynamics with Tom Woodruff, and he was also an acolyte of Stan Winston, who worked on the first the first two sequels he worked on. And on this was also John Vulich, who was Savini's like protege in the early 80s and his top assistant, as well as Jim Cagle, who did the iconic sculpt, the Part 4 sculpt of Jason's head for Part 4, and Larry Carr, who had worked, I think, on Part 2 and Part 3 as an effects artist as well. Mm-hmm. So what I'm getting at here is this was an unbelievable lineup. And what a launching pad for talent in the special effects arena the Friday films have been.
Yeah. It's interesting, though, too, that you mentioned in your intro the first guy was Andrew Greg Canham.
I'm glad you just brought him up as well.
Because he's the one who actually sculpted the Jason face that we see in the movie. Savini, like you said, he was brought in after Canham left, and he says, like in interviews, like I didn't even do that sculpt. Luckily, he based it on my earlier designs, so it looks great. It was a great design to go with, but he didn't actually make that Jason face.
It's so strange to me because when you read the anecdotal evidence of why Greg Canham departed this production, which I also thought was strangely similar to what had happened to Stan Winston on the previous two sequels, that Stan Winston had come on board and was ostensibly the first choice to replace Savini on the previous two sequels, and due to compromises or creative clashes, ultimately, even though some of his work remained evident on screen, he departed the production. On Part 2, it was Carl Fullerton, another really brilliant artist who came on that got his start in the Friday franchise. And then on Part 3, Stan Winston, of course, was replaced by another great artist, Douglas White, and his team, who had some 3D experience and some prosthetic experience, had worked on movies like Sword in the Stone and Sword and the Sorcerer and films like that.
I wonder if Savini worked with Zito on The Prowler.
Yes,
and
exactly.
I'm surprised he wasn't...
As an actor and a special effects artist.
I'm surprised he just wasn't the first choice to begin with, unless maybe Savini turned it down initially?
Here is what happened. And it's a really interesting testament. It's an anecdotal testament to Savini as essentially just an artist.
Yeah.
Like Savini at the time in the early 80s, going through the 80s, living this nomadic... sort of journeyman lifestyle, going from film set to film set, honestly, warts and all, at the detriment of his family, which he sort of... I know there's always
a possibility... You mean like a wife and kids type of thing?
There's always the possibility that Tom Savini could hear these episodes, and if he was listening to what I'm about to say, I say this just objectively and with all due respect, but anecdotally you read a lot of talk about the fact that Savini was not really around for his family life as much. He devoted his passion, his life, and his experience to the world of special effects and illusions, these grand illusions. He even titled his book Grand Illusions. And he was so tied to the world of cinema, into acting, filmmaking, special effects, stunts, that I think it wasn't so much that he was some awful father or terrible husband. I just think he had run away with the circus long time before, and he just never came back.
But I kept reading when I was doing my research for this film, a lot of people would refer to this as one of Savini's last great effects films. Well, when did he stop?
Well, here's the thing. This is what is so interesting about it. At the time that the final chapter was crewing up, When Joseph Zito had sort of this falling out with Greg Canham and decided, you know what, I'm just going to call Tom Savini and see if I can get him to come down here and supervise at least. It wasn't a movie Savini was working on. He was working on this literal passion project of his that happened to be a haunted attraction in North Carolina, like a state-of-the-art haunted house.
Right.
That imagine that for a brief moment in time, you could have gone down to North Carolina or up, depending, or fly to North Carolina, depending on where you are, and you could have experienced a haunted house attraction designed and implemented by Tom Savini and his team at that time in the early 80s.
I hope people got sprayed with blood going through it.
Listen, I have been trying to find footage of this haunted attraction. I'm not even sure that it actually came to completion. Because here's the thing. When Joseph Zito contacted Savini and said, look, I'm in a jam here. We've got a release date and I lost my head of effects. Savini had to make a crucial decision. He had to literally pick up his entire team, pack up his van, and drive them all up to the set to film, or go to California to film. He would have to leave behind this passion project, this haunted attraction, which he chose to. And the reason why, the exact quote he has said time and time in interview after interview, and is he said, I created this monster and I'm going to be the one that comes back to kill him. But
he found it very fitting.
But yet, if you really look at the brass tacks, I think of the day-to-day operations on set during the final chapter's special effects process of production, you see it was really the Kevin Yeager, Alec Gillis that you see in a lot of the set photos, down and dirty. I think Savini, and this is my speculation, and based only on the research I've done this month, and over the years, of course, but I think Savini was there literally as a supervisor and literally as a mentor figure. He was like an idol to these kids. And I think because he came to that set, Savini, and blessed these young artists with his expertise and his literal genius, those artists were better able to explode onto the scene after the final chapter to become iconic creators in their own right.
Well, he wants to set up a few guys who are as good as him, so he doesn't always have to get the call from every film, right?
Well, I've read that there were people. Other special effects houses were actually quite critical of Savini at that time because he was a notorious headhunter of talent. And so many of the younger artists that were only a few years younger than Savini, but only that far down the line, had been such a fan of even his recent work that they idolized him, even though he was basically not that much older, like I just said, than them. They idolized him. He was the top dog of that arena at that time. And I find it so interesting the way his art evolved. If Savini hadn't worked on Creepshow with Romero, and he hadn't learned from Rob Bottin through literally a series of phone calls from that Creepshow set, how to create animatronic effects so he could execute the fluffy puppet, the monster in the crate from Creepshow, you wouldn't have had the show-stopping Jason death that occurs at the end of the final chapter. As Jason's head is sliding down that machete and the eyes are moving and the tongue is coming out of the mouth, all those animatronic effects were machinations and functions Savini learned on that Creepshow set, ostensibly from Rob Bottin, who was at that time the master of animatronics.
It's a big difference in 4 years from the first movie where Savini is doing everything, stunts, makeup, story ideas, in
the first movie, he's literally at times using kids' paint palettes he bought at a local hardware store to touch up blood on makeup on people's faces.
He's half the reason the first movie, is as successful as it was, and then 4 years later, like you said, he's more in that sort of backseat supervisor role.
In a half of a decade, Savini went from an upstart himself to literally the king of the jungle.
Oh, yeah.
And it was really in a very short amount of years, in a short amount of films.
4 years, he goes from sort of that you have to do everything yourself thing to having, like you said, an entourage.
Well, much like Dick Smith before him, and I would say like Chris Nelson after him, Savini is a true genius. He's a genius artist, much like the other two gentlemen I just named, one that came before Savini and one that came after Savini that I would use as examples, Chris Nelson and Dick Smith. That lineage, that three-man lineage, I always think of in my mind as a direct genetic lineage in the history of horror, special effects, and prosthetic appliances and makeup. Dick Smith to Savini to Chris Nelson.
Those three guys are like, it's like like a musician that... Those guys, it's like just in their soul, like that they're
That's
not
exactly
thinking about
right.
it. They're not. It's just they can do it, and they can do all of it, and it's just they are pure, makeup effects running through their veins.
I have a admiration and literal love for Tom Savini. I have never met the man in my life, and I really do hope to rectify that. But even barring the fact that I've never physically met the man, I have literal love for that man. He has given me personally, as a fan of the horror genre, a literal lifetime of happiness, comfort, and enjoyment. And I'm also steadfastly mind blown. And talking about the final chapter, some of the effect sequences in the final chapter are amongst the greatest the franchise ever captured. And I can't wait till we're watching the movie in a little bit from now to talk about that.
If only all the kills were left untouched
we'll
before
get to
the
that
MPA.
too.
But getting towards eventually watching the movie, we should talk about 1984 in general, what was going on, the other films, because as you like to say, this was a banger of a year for movies. I mean, so many classics came out, like the top 20 movies are, I don't think there's anything that isn't considered a classic.
Can you possibly read off a few of the top 10 or top 20 films of 1984, just generally?
I mean, Ghostbusters, The Terminator, Indiana Jones,
Wait,
Temple of Doom.
Ghostbusters was number one?
I don't. I think,
you're just listing just movies?
I don't know if these are
List
in order
of
of money, but I do think Ghostbusters could have been number one.
List some of the big ones.
Ghostbusters, Terminator, Temple of Doom. I mean, this is Spinal Tap, Gremlins,
Karate Kid, The Natural, Beverly Hills Cop,
A Nightmare on Elm Street, The Killing Fields,
Buckaroo Banzai Across the Eighth Dimension, one of my favorites. What else?
Starman.
Oh my God, Red Dawn, Wolverines. Red Dawn. Have you seen? Let me ask you something real quick. Yeah. David Lynch's Dune. Oh yeah, 1984.
Yeah.
Have you've seen the original John Milius Red Dawn, right?
Oh God, I loved it.
You know what? About a year ago, I happened to see it offered on iTunes for like $1.99, so I rented it, and I said I haven't seen this movie in decades. You can almost classify Red Dawn as a horror movie.
No,
that movie is goddamn terrifying.
It's scary.
I did not realize how bleak and how dark Red Dawn actually is.
And as a kid, I can distinctly remember the scene when they're in the classroom and the guys are parachuting onto the fields around them. That idea freaked me the hell out.
Or Patrick Swayze and C. Thomas Howell seeing their father in the internment camp on the other side of the fence. C. Thomas Howell's acting in Red Dawn. Patrick Swayze's acting in Red Dawn is almost like mind-boggling. It's so charismatic and brilliant. Well, give me a couple more.
I mean, non-horror.
The Last Starfighter. That's Nick Castle.
Yeah. 2010, Splash.
Wow. Police Academy.
Footloose. I mean, it was
Streets of Fire. That's a great underrated kind of cult film.
The Natural. I mean, it's like everything was a big movie then. So, if you're making a slasher flick, no matter what, you're not going to probably get too high up in that list. Even the best slashers. But you have Nightmare on Elm Street that comes out, and I do think that is above final chapter in terms of numbers.
Let me hit you with a little bit of the horror landscape of 1984.
Yeah.
Now, of course, we covered this year in our season 2 premiere when we talked about A Nightmare on Elm Street, which, of course, came out the same year as the final chapter, 1984. But let me throw you a few of the other movies, horror-wise, that came out that year. How about Chud? Remember Chud?
Oh my God.
Cannibalistic, humanoid, underground dwellers. Still, I think one of the greatest, most underrated designs of any monster of the 80s. Those Chuds were really kind of scary looking, weren't they? They sort of look like mutated, further mutated versions of Chunk from Goonies, except green with the kind of eyes on two different... They sort of had that later Jason Voorhees look, kind of with the droopy eye. A movie that I think doesn't get enough attention in the broader horror conversation, and I think it's because some people may not even realize it's actually a horror movie, Neil Jordan's The Company of Wolves. Do you remember that? It had a very fascinating werewolf transformation scene. You always hear about the Howling and the American Werewolf transformation scenes as the great werewolf transformation scenes of the 80s, which they are.
Yeah.
But if you want to see a quite unique one, check out Company of Wolves, where the wolf, an actual wolf, comes out of the mouth of a woman. And it's done practically. And it's quite interesting. Firestarter came out in 1984.
Wow. God, I love that
What
one.
an iconic character Drew Barrymore plays in that. The iconography of Firestarter, for whatever reason, really sticks in my consciousness. I must have seen that movie when I was very young, because it's one of those films that's really kind of embedded in my psyche, Firestarter.
That was one of the early movies like my father had copied on VHS to keep at home. And it was on the same VHS as Red Dawn.
You want to hear a really...
So that tape really screwed me up.
You want to hear a really interesting fun fact about 1984? Sure. Wes Craven directed 3 films that year. Did we
talk about that when we did Nightmare?
To be honest with you, I don't think I brought, or either of us brought this point up.
Yeah.
But we may have. Okay. I think I bring this up later in season 2.
Okay.
When I talk about how busy Wes Craven was through the 80s. But in 1984, he directed A Nightmare on Elm Street, iconic. Yeah. He also directed The Hills Have Eyes Part 2. And up until preparing for this episode, I actually, shamefully enough, and I'll admit it, I did not realize Wes Craven directed Hills Have Eyes 2, but he did. And believe it or not, when I started digging into that really quick and went down a little quick Hills Have Eyes Part 2 rabbit hole the other night, it seems like a lot of fans actually prefer the sequel to the original. Huh. So I'm going to have to check that one out, because I don't even remember the sequel, so I'm going to have to watch that and see what I think. He also directed, let me see, I have it in here. Oh, yes. It was a television movie starring Robert Urich called Invitation to Hell. Horror film just made for television. Yeah. So 3 films that year. We also had, one of my favorite films of that era that I used to rent repeatedly from Video Paradise. It was called Night of the Comet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it was sort of like a poppy sort of horror comedy. Yeah. A sort of gateway horror, you could probably call it.
I remember that when it hit like HBO or something on
it was probably
rapid repeat,
on like Showtime or HBO, being played like 7 times a day. Yeah. Okay, there's a director, an Australian director I've always been a pretty big fan of, named Russell Mulcahy. He made both the first 2 Highlander movies, as well as a really underrated movie from the 90s starring Alec Baldwin called The Shadow. Do you remember when it was like based on like a 1940s comic book?
Yeah. Big hat and the cloth over the nose.
And it sort of became a over-bloated budget that didn't make much money at the box office, so it was considered sort of a big bomb.
Yeah.
And yet, if you go and check this movie out now, you would almost think Sam Raimi had directed it.
I was just going to say, it feels like a predecessor to Darkman in my memory.
I cannot believe, in my literal notes, I said when I was checking out, preparing for this episode, I noticed this about Russell Mulcahy, made me think of The Shadow, so I rewatched The Shadow. I was like, this movie could be set in the same universe. It's like a prequel to Darkman.
Yeah. That's what my memory feels
it's like. Russell Mulcahy could have directed Darkman, and Sam Raimi could have directed The Shadow. They're almost interchangeable. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, back to 1984.
Yeah.
Russell Mulcahy has one of his early first early hits, a giant mutated Australian mutated pig exploitation movie called Razorback. Do you remember that title? And when I tell you this pig is like the size of Jaws.
No, I don't. It's not ringing a bell at the moment.
Imagine a surlier, down under version of Jaws.
But
instead of a 30-foot shark, it's a 30-foot pig. Okay? That's what you're going for there.
Okay.
It's actually pretty damn good.
Yeah.
Well, it's actually sort of like two movies in one.
Hey, really quick, do you
Yeah.
consider Jaws a horror film?
Oh, I consider Jaws a horror film. I think you could make an argument that Jaws is a slasher film.
Yeah,
the only
I think
thing
if it
is
was
that
made
Jaws,
by a lesser
the shark
director,
is the killer.
and it's just a good filmmaker.
Jaws is clearly a horror film.
Yeah, yeah.
Why? Why would you even ask that?
I don't know. I just all of a sudden I was like, it just popped in my head.
You don't think Jaws is a horror film?
I just don't think I ever wondered until this very moment. It was
mean, it's
just
not-
Jaws
it's
is
not
Jaws,
like
you know.
a
It's almost
romantic
its
fantasy.
own thing, you know.
Yeah, I guess. You
know,
it's sort of a. I would
it's
say
like
it's
a slasher film, but directed by a really good director. You know,
exactly.
It's
Just like The Terminator is
Yeah.
a slasher film directed by an amazing director.
yeah.
The Terminator and Jaws, I hate to break it to you guys, they're both slasher movies. They even came out during the slasher era, both of them.
Yeah.
Jaws was a little early, I'll give it that.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
a little before,
It
but
became
not early.
popular.
I don't think it was
Yeah.
earlier than
But it was
Texas
around.
Chainsaw.
Yeah, no,
so
yeah.
theoretically, it was part of the slasher era.
Yeah.
So I see Jaws as a slasher antagonist. Sue me.
Okay. Anyway,
Also, here's a real one of Quentin Tarantino's favorite horror films of all time, 1984, Silent Night, Deadly Night.
yeah.
Talk about a controversial movie. The only reason more people weren't out picketing the final chapter was because they were so busy out picketing the depiction of a slasher Santa Claus in Silent Night, Deadly Night. Also, connecting to Ronnie Yu, who directed Freddy vs. Jason, he had a film called The Tenant that is I have never seen it, but apparently it's a very well-regarded extreme horror film of 1984. I did not realize Ronnie Yu was making films all the way back into the early 80s, but I guess he was. And finally, I wanted to throw this one out there. Sort of a horror comedy, certainly one of the most iconic films of the 80s, and made by one of the most iconic filmmakers of the 80s, The Toxic Avenger.
Yes.
Made by, of course, I don't even have to tell you guys, but Lloyd Kaufman. Mm-hmm. Lloyd
And
Kaufman.
there's a remake or reboot or something happening now, or they just filmed
They
it?
made a reboot. I know Macon Blair is the director. It actually stars Peter Dinklage from Game of Thrones as the Toxic Avenger. Now, this movie, the remake, we're recording this, Joe and I, in 2025. And the remake had to have been filmed like more than 2 years ago. So
It hasn't come out yet,
No,
right?
and
Yeah.
I don't know. So
Yeah.
there has to. That can never mean
Yeah.
good things.
Yeah.
And I would imagine the problem in terms of marketing a remake of The Toxic Avenger would be the tone and the sort of, well, what's the genre of it? Is it a comedy? Is it horror? It's very hard to market horror comedies.
Yeah.
If you look at the history of box office of horror comedies over the years, it's probably the hardest hybrid to sell.
Yeah.
It's
That
an audience.
director, on a personal note, I was just interviewing the director from The Hunt for Scream Factory stuff, and in the movie The Hunt, the director who did this Toxic Avenger
Lloyd Kaufman.
remake, he has a role
Oh,
in
the
that
remake,
movie.
Macon Blair. He's also an actor. Yeah. Yep.
He was in The Hunt as an actor. He's like,
If you wanna
he's
see-
a diplomat anyway.
If you want to see Macon Blair acting in a movie where he will blow your head off as an actor, if you haven't seen it, it's called Blue Ruin. Check that movie out.
Yeah.
It's another one of these movies. Strangely enough, going back to what we were just talking about, you could call Blue Ruin, certainly you could call it thematically a horror movie.
Yeah.
The darkness of the film, the bleak atmosphere, the tone, the violence, you could easily classify this film as a horror movie. Yet, would it sit on a horror movie shelf in a horror movie shelf in a video store? I doubt it. But again, another one of those movies that's hard to classify.
Yeah.
And so many of those hard to classify films end up being some of the great films because they're so hard to classify. They become original,
Right,
and
exactly.
dynamic.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's always worth searching out those types of films. But I don't know. There's still so much to talk about, but we should save some of it for
we
the
should
film.
do our thank yous and then get to
Yeah.
the movie at this point.
All of you guys are here, obviously, to watch Friday the 13th, the final chapter, with us here in Joe's basement. But of course, I we would be absolutely remiss if we didn't take a quick moment, especially now, at this point in time and space where Joe and I are, for our listeners in the past, present, and future. Again, Joe and I are recording this episode in March of 2025. Right now, our channel has been experiencing some really astronomical growth that has absolutely staggered both Joe and myself.
I'm stunned.
And my mom. My mom. Wait, the first thing.
Are you sure it's not all
listen to
your
me.
mom actually
the first
giving us the views?
Joe actually once said to me, "You don't think your mom has like a bot army she's been using
Just
to
wants us
drive
to
up our
feel good.
views
Yeah.
so that you are less depressed?" I was like, I doubt it. But my mom, the first thing she does, she wakes up in the morning, she's always checking our numbers. How are the views? How are the subscribers? It's so funny.
Get her
I get
on
that
the
text
payroll.
all the time.
Mrs.
But
White, you're hired.
the only reason I bring it up is not out of some vainglorious reason. I bring it up because Joe and I are so sincerely stupefied and deeply, almost like, not almost, sentimentally appreciative of every single one of you that takes the time out of your busy lives, your busy schedules, to support our creativity here at Haddonfield Radio. When we started this series, the specific goal that we had, that we continue with to literally this very day, is simply to reach out to other fans of all of these movies that we love and to share our perspective, our enthusiasm, our critical eye with other fans who appreciate the same things the same ways. As our channel grows, what it really means to Joe and I is that it's just an ever-evolving community of friendly, hospitable, kind, incredibly knowledgeable and talented people out there. I love the fact that there are people out there that are doing their Lyft driving. There are people out there doing their, Uber Eats deliveries, Amazon drivers, all out there listening to you and I jibber-jabber incessantly about now 26 horror movies, 26 plus horror movies. I want you to know, if you can hear my voice in your delivery vehicle right now, and I'm talking to you right there, you, the one in the shirt, the one with the legs, you. If you're listening to our voice right now, I want you to know we love you. We deeply and sincerely appreciate you. And no words that neither Joe or I could ever come up with will honestly and truly sum up how appreciative we are of you. If you're walking your dog and listening to this, like I do with my dog Wally, if you're in your car, if you're laying down to go to bed and you listen to our voices to fall asleep, which I don't blame you, I want you to know on behalf of Joe and myself, we love you and we appreciate you. Every YouTube video or Spotify, podcast you listen to, you're going to hear the hosts prattle on about how much they appreciate you. Like, share, subscribe. Joe and I, honestly, the only thing we care about when we're creating Haddonfield Radio, the single idea that we adhere to is entertaining you guys as best as we can. If there's anything we can do better, if there's something that you think we're missing, let us know in the comments section. I'm telling you, and it's true, the squeaky wheels definitely get the grease. If you've got constructive criticism of what we're doing, let us know. We are doing this to create something for you. If we can make it better, let us know. And when you do so, always, if you're going to comment, let us know where you're commenting from. We love finding out about all these different people, literally all over the world, listening to us. Two nobodies. It's amazing. So anyway, I could go on and on, but...
No, as the channel grows, it just gives us it shows us that we're on the right path and that there's reason to keep doing it and doing it, as best we can. Because obviously,
it's really the master kind of programming that Joe and I have in our brains when it comes to Haddonfield Radio. We try our hardest. I give you our word on that, and I promise you that we're trying to create the most entertaining, comforting, and interesting 3-hour episodes that we can be. We're not perfect. We make plenty of mistakes. We get plenty of things wrong, and I always love when you guys are kind enough to correct us. That really, we take that criticism very seriously, and we try to grow from it.
Yeah, I mean, we see every comment. Sometimes it takes
everything.
us, a little time, but we always see it. We will respond, and we will engage if there is direct questions being asked of us and everything.
Like, I just want to say, like, on the last episode, the Friday Part 3 episode, the comment section was probably my favorite comment section of any of the 25 episodes so far. Just people bringing up these interesting facets, interesting ideas, contradictory thoughts.
Yep.
And Joe and I would be texting each other, but did you see the latest comment? Did you see the latest? So we take these comments very seriously. This is our only real way, besides the Instagram page, that we can hear from you guys to know if you are happy with what we're doing. Because obviously we want to create something you guys like. We're trying to create something that's entertaining for you. So let us know if we can ever be doing that better for you, because we really will try to do that. Am I right?
Yeah, we take everything seriously.
We really,
as much as we joke around when we talk.
We really do seriously, literally seriously love you, every single one of you, and appreciate every single one of you. It never ceases to blow my mind to think about the fact, and I'm sure this is true, I would guess that the majority of people listening to us talk about these movies know more than us about these movies. So our goal is not to be standing up here on a pulpit trying to preach to you, here's how these events unfolded. We're just giving you our fan perspective on these movies as two fans of these movies. And we look forward to hearing back your perspective in the comment section, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So it always helps, and it really reaffirms what we're doing here, and it helps us to know what we could be doing better.
Especially with this series, I'm sort of learning as I go. I've always watched these films, but I never studied them. We're like Halloween films. Yeah, I feel, a little more
we were
sort
very
of ingrained knowledge.
Right. I would say even like the first 2 seasons, Joe and I felt, I think I can honestly admit that we felt more confident starting those seasons.
Yeah.
I feel more that I'm learning as I'm going. Of course, I've been watching the Friday the 13th films my entire life.
Yeah.
But learning the nuts and bolts and the real detail of the behind-the-scenes stories of these films is so enlightening, and I feel like a lot of it I'm learning for the first time, which is so much fun.
It is, and I'm appreciating the movie so much more, and I'm becoming so much more of a bigger fan of this franchise as we go into it more and more.
This is actually becoming, and then I'll shut up, this is actually already becoming my favorite season so far, I have to admit. I'm having the most fun of any of the seasons of Haddonfield Radio thus far, producing these episodes. I've had a blast being down here in Joe's basement watching these movies, and I'm so excited that we have so many more movies to go in the Friday the 13th story.
Yeah, a lot more.
And it occurred to me the other day real quick, by the time this season is done, Joe and I will have essentially created for you guys a 33-plus hour-long documentary, essentially, about the Friday the 13th franchise.
Yeah,
so it's... We're having a blast. I hope you guys are having fun too, because literally that's what we're doing it for. Yeah. And I promise I will not say the word literally again, even though literally I can't really promise that.
All right. So without further ado, shall we start the movie?
Yeah, I think beyond any doubt, we should jump into the movie. 1984, Joseph Zito and the Mancusos, Friday the 13th, the final chapter from Paramount Pictures. I say we dive, or I should say we deep dive right in right now.
Splash. Here we go. Infamous Paramount logo before it.
It never gets old seeing that venerable movie logo in front of a Friday the 13th film. So they weren't that embarrassed or that ashamed, because they're embellishing themselves all over the beginning of this film. They certainly, like I said, weren't embarrassed to take the money these movies made.
No, I think it was all about money at the end of the day for Paramount, and, here's our classic montage to get people up to speed, which Joe Zito was kind of against, and him and his editors had no part in adding this to the film.
Like I said, this, I think, was actually even cut together, produced, created, and conceived by Frank Mancuso Jr., and he was right to place this at the beginning of the final chapter. I think this film's legacy only grows in esteem when you look at it as the culmination of the first 4 films. I think when you see this film that way, it works better than itself as just a standalone horror film. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And a part of and parcel of that is I love the inclusion of these catch-up montages. I think it just gets you in the mood of the movie you're about to see. And it also works on a narrative level and an exposition level. So
it gives you the ability to bring in fresh eyes who haven't seen the other films, and so that they still know what's going on. You're not going to leave anybody feeling lost just because they haven't watched the other installments.
I really admire, I think, what Joseph Zito was able to accomplish with the final chapter, but I do have to say, I do kind of wish Steve Miner had returned just to sort of put his signature on these first 4 films.
Or even beyond. You wonder what would happen if you just had sort of one director helming most of the franchise.
Well, because the Friday franchise is very episodic in nature, I think that would have worked.
Yeah.
To have almost like what you would call in television like a showrunner.
Exactly. Which Mancuso Jr.
really
kind of was.
Yep. I don't think Frank Mancuso Jr. gives himself enough credit in that regard.
Right.
But it's funny when you just said that. I think you're absolutely right. He really was the showrunner of these first few sequels.
Mm-hmm. And did you read at all about how Zito ended up, he actually got the job to direct and write the film?
Right. He basically accepted that because he wanted the job so badly.
Well, because of the money, they were giving him extra money, and once they presented the payday to him, he was like, "Yeah, I can do it." And then he went and hired the other 2 guys to help him out, which ultimately, though, it got.
And let me just say, just for Joseph Zito's on Joseph Zito's side, he paid for those 2 writers out of his salary.
Right, but then he had to start doing this crazy back and forth thing because, he would. Zito still had to talk to Phil Scuderi in Boston.
Right.
With constant updates about what was going on. So he would talk to him about where he's at with the story, and then Scuderi would give him notes, and then he would go meet with the writers.
And the 2 writers.
And then the writers would.
It was Bruce Hidemi-Sakau and Barney Cohen.
Mainly Cohen in terms of writing the actual screenplay.
Right.
And so it was sort of this extreme back and forth thing for Zito. Because
one of the things I was the most sort of surprised by in researching the final chapter was actually how much Phil Scuderi was still involved with the franchise.
Well, in the story, specifically too.
He was really like a back channel consultant on this film.
Whatever he added to the mix, I'm assuming money of some sort. Part of his deal must have been to have some sort of say in where things go.
He was also an excellent resource. I mean, if you can reach out to him, why not?
I mean, one of the guys who's been there from the beginning, right?
And he had a professional friendship with Joseph Zito. He was sort of a fan of Joseph Zito and a supporter. And Phil Scuderi had said to Joseph Zito around the time when Part 3 was being made, if there is a Part 4, I'm going to get you this job as the director. And Joseph Zito, of course, thought everybody in Hollywood tells you they're going to do that for you. But Phil Scuderi actually came through.
And Cohen actually got in trouble for getting the credit for the screenplay with the Writers Guild because, again, he was sort of not officially hired to write it. You know what I mean? And if you're going to get the credit, then you should have been doing this job through the guild, like a union almost. You know what I'm saying?
Right. Especially since at this point the films are not some sort of negative pickup for Paramount,
Right.
where the film is already produced and Paramount Pictures picks it up for a distribution deal. At this point, Paramount Pictures is producing these films.
And this scene is the only film in the series to shoot new footage in the exact set on the exact sets and locations from a previous film. And because right here they are back on the actual that movie ranch from part 3.
And again, boy, does Joseph Zito make the most of the environment with this really incredible one-er.
Yeah.
One shot that takes you in through the carnage.
I'm glad you
and
bring it up.
Brings you up to speed with the character you're ostensibly here for, Jason Voorhees.
So this whole shot, it's something I'm kind of just becoming aware was being done a lot back then when with Steadicams were new. So there's a guy with a Steadicam, and he was literally up on the crane, up on that, big giant camera jib, and he kind of comes down with it, and he actually walks off of it and then continues the shot. And I mean, it's
Wait a minute.
Like,
so what you're saying is he is attached to the camera jib himself, with the camera.
Yeah, exactly.
And as the crane gets down to the ground level,
he just steps off
and continues the shot.
Yeah, and that
handheld.
Yeah, and that was more common than.
Oh my God!
Than you would imagine. I think Halloween 2 did something very similar that I was just made aware of. But yeah, Zito kind of goes all out with this whole scene.
Just to credit where credit is due, the cinematographer here on the final chapter is João Fernandes.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And that's a name, I'll be honest, I hadn't heard before
new to the series.
Filmmaking.
Yeah.
And yet, I think, again, especially with some of the lighting setups in the final chapter, they're incredibly professional looking, moody, and interesting.
Retro a little bit.
That's
it's
right.
Interesting. I feel like this movie has got a sort of softness to its image at times, with the lighting specifically, that is more old school in its approach.
I have to say, after what happened in Part 3, when they were filming Part 3 and had to accommodate for the 3D effects, they had to overlight all of the sets, which is really a hard thing to do when you're making a horror film of all things. Yeah. But I think this film really reestablishes, like you were just saying, some of the tonal similarities of the first two films, really especially Sean S. Cunningham's original.
Yeah.
I think some of the lighting, and like you said, some of the soft lighting setups in Final Chapter really feel very much connected to the look of the first film. And again, I find that an interesting way of sort of tonally tying this a bow around these first four films.
For me, this film is a mix of, at times you have a feel of the early films, the independent filmmaking type feel. And then also, like this, with helicopters and everything else, you have a little bit of that Hollywood edge, a little bit of the bigger production to it all.
Yet it never feels separate from any of the other films in the series.
So those people you just saw in the room there were supposed to be part of a bigger scene, whereas all upset parents of the kids who were killed in Part 3.
Wait a minute. So there was any of that filmed?
No, they talk about that. It just, I think, they ran out of time and everything.
Yeah.
But that one shot was a leftover from that idea. There was also supposed to be a scene with the ambulance carrying Jason where it actually gets stuck in the mud on the way, and I'm not sure if Jason was supposed to kind of pop back out then, or it was just supposed to be like a tense moment,
a red herring moment.
Is he going to come back here?
Right,
because
right.
Again,
that would have been creative. That would have been cool.
Part of what Zito was doing, I know earlier I mentioned how, like, in this movie, Jason doesn't really, there's no particular reason why he's still alive. He's just still alive. And Zito kind of knew that the audience would be anticipating Jason coming back and waiting for it. And his idea was to...
You can use it as a tension exercise.
It was almost like that the audience themselves would be the ones
like
to bring him back.
Jason, exactly.
Like their excitement
I love that.
is what kind of brings him back to life.
So cool.
And he didn't need to overly explain it.
Now that's cool. I also want to ask you this question.
Yeah.
What is it with this weird trope that we were just witnessing in the previous scene of medical examiners or coroners who are eating while dealing with the dead? And
I
even
think it's
the
just
thing
supposed
with
to show it's just not a big deal to these people.
But even the thing with like placing the sandwich down on the body, I swear has been in other films.
Sure.
You want to talk about a great medical examiner performance? John Carpenter in Body Bags.
Okay. This nurse, if you looked at her name tag, R. Morgan, is in tribute to the actress R. Morgan from the first film who played Annie.
Oh my God. And you know, it's funny. I was looking at her name tag and wondering, I wonder if that's like someone in the crew. So that's an interesting little fun fact.
And another fun fact, girl on the TV, who this was a real aerobicized tape that was out back then, and it is starring a girl that ends up being in Friday the 13th Part 6, I believe.
Oh, wow.
Hold on, I gotta find my
That's interesting.
my actual note here about
Joe's
it. With
literally
more
going through
specifics, I know,
14 or 15 pages of fun facts.
Yeah, I know. I can't even find it. But yes, she's in a later Friday the 13th movie.
I love
oddly.
that the media refers to it as the Crystal Lake Massacre.
Right.
I think that in universe, the way I wish you see more like you do in the Halloween movies. You always see the media, little glimpses of the media's reaction
Right.
to Michael Myers' violence.
Right.
And I love seeing it like right here, a little reflective in universe. Expressions of the media. In that actor on the television screen, I've seen in numerous movies and television shows.
Oh God, yes.
Numerous.
Yes.
He's such one of those that guy faces.
Right.
Oh, it's that guy.
Yep, definitely. There's I believe the body count in this movie is 14.
Okay,
Well, I mean, some people say you see 13, but there's the old mom of the Jarvis family. We don't see her get killed,
but
in this cut,
right.
But of course, there's a famous alternate ending that was shot and not used, where the daughter clearly finds the mom upstairs. Well, it's a dream, but I mean, I think it drives home that she's dead.
Yeah,
you know?
right. So, generally speaking, and I was going to ask you this because I forgot to look it up. It's considered there are 14 kills, or
if you want to include the mom. Some people debate the mom thing, but I believe if you count the mom, we're at.
I had this
14.
weird idea the other day, and this might sound too on the nose.
Yeah.
But if I had been there at the beginning of this franchise, I think one of the cool ideas might have been for every single Friday the 13th film to have 13 kills. Like each movie has 13 kills. And it becomes something as an audience member you can almost, predict and count in the theater as it's happening.
Yeah.
But in some of the films, I think the last film had 13 victims. Of course, if you horribly count the unborn baby, there's 13 victims. And maybe even in part 2. Again, fans that know more than me, please don't,
It could be why they try
string
to
me up for not knowing that.
It could be why they will push that there's only 13 in this one, because they want to keep it at 13.
But do you think that would have felt too gimmicky to say 13? Every film has 13 individual creative deaths or kills. I just think that would have been cool. It's just something that occurred to me.
This is cool right here. The little puff of breath that you see right there.
Yes.
It's actually cigarette smoke, because they just didn't have the ability to
so the
cool things down. And
so the performer lying there,
is like holding in like a
he
hit.
couldn't have waited to
They wanted it.
He wanted that.
Yes.
Okay.
It was
Interesting.
yep. It was supposed to give you the first sort of sign that he's alive. And I think earlier, we already went by it, where the hand falls out. Yeah, because he's up now.
This is a very, very Savini-esque kill.
And, they had made a whole head there to twist, a fake one, but they didn't end up using it because they just did it through, camera
Trickery.
tricks. Yeah,
right,
making it look like
and
his
it looks
head was,
great.
Yeah.
And actually, that effect actually is successful, in my opinion, due to the sound effect that's applied to it. That when the neck twists.
And this nurse right here, this scene, she got injured there was a button that the costume designers put inside that hat right on the back of her head.
Okay.
And the director and Ted White didn't realize that. So when he slammed her against the wall, the button went into her head.
Oh, I can almost imagine how horrible that would feel.
Yeah.
I just want to say a couple quick things. I love the design of Jason in this film that the amazing performer Ted White wears. But one thing, especially in that shot we just saw of him holding her up against the wall, that stands out is you can really see his hands, his wrists, his fingernails, his fingers, the back of his head. He already looks dead to me.
Yeah,
it's something that is an interesting thing that stands out to me in Jason's look in this film, is to me, he looks like he's already dead. Do you know what I mean?
Well, yeah. So, continuity people will like to point out that even though this is the next day, in part 3, he has sort of normal hands and nails. And then on this one, his skin becomes gray and is blackened and long, cracked nails. So, I think that's just Savini being a guy who he's going to do the whole thing. He's going to give you the whole. And speaking of Savini, fun fact, obviously Tommy Jarvis is a whole thing is a tribute to Savini.
Yeah,
His
the name Tommy is literally connected to Savini.
The kid makes masks and effects and all that.
He essentially is like a little kid version of Tom Savini.
Exactly.
Because when Tom Savini was Tommy Jarvis's age, Tom Savini was literally Tommy Jarvis. That's the same kid. This is what he was into when Tom Savini was a child. These were his obsessions. He was rummaging every day through his mother's purse looking for her lipstick and makeup so he could create these gnarly looks on him and the neighborhood kids' faces. So Savini had actually been doing this since he was Tommy Jarvis's age. Now, this actor here that's in the front passenger seat.
Yep.
As soon as I saw the reference in his career that he was on the television show Matthew Starr.
Yeah, The Powers of Matthew Starr.
Do you remember this show?
No.
Okay, because the minute I heard about that when I was looking him up, I had this like nostalgia explosion. I have a vivid memory of my childhood home on Carl Road and seeing The Powers of Matthew Starr. Was that what it was called?
Yep.
An episode on TV. So I'm trying to figure out what year that was, and I must have been 7 or 8 years old around then.
And it also...
I don't remember it literally, I just have this vision of it.
That show also starred Ginny Field from...
Amy Steele, wasn't it?
Who played Ginny Field.
Yeah, Amy Steele was on that show as well.
So, and supposedly she kind of talked him into...
auditioning for this fourth movie.
Because she had already done one.
I always find this weird anecdote with these, or anecdotal evidence in these sequels in the Friday franchise. A lot of these young actors were literal nobodies for the most part, and yet most of them, they were wanting to refuse to audition for a major movie because of the attaché of negativity in the mass media and in the pop culture about these slasher films.
And there's a little different thinking in the casting of this one. Not that any of these kids are necessarily names yet, but they weren't unknowns where the previous films were a little more unknown. Most of these people had been acting on TV, smaller roles, enough that
but they weren't superstars able to turn roles down.
But they were a little more recognizable. I'm just saying the casting people's thought processes. They wanted some sort of actors that kind of knew what they were doing a little bit, had worked, a little more recognizable.
I find it so weird that Pamela Voorhees' gravesite is literally just on the side of a road.
And this is the first time we get her name. This is where we get her first name for the first time.
Which I did not realize. That's very fun fact.
And they got the year wrong. Another fun fact.
Wait, the year on the grave is wrong?
It says she died in 79, and it should be 1980. It wasn't even a Friday the 13th on the
Also, why is there a huge blood stain on the front seat of that car? Did you see it a second ago?
Notice that,
there is a giant drenched blood stain on the car. What was going on in these kids' lives prior to the start of this movie?
They were
This
testing
is
out some of the
actually
effects.
this
you know?
is actually one of my favorite characters in this film right here.
Yeah.
And I think the banana squish is actually one of the most iconic moments in slasher history. For as obscure and strange, that sign flip I think is a riot. This actor,
Yeah.
she's great. She's so memorable.
The funny story was the actor, the character rather, like in the script is literally like labeled like chubby girl or something like that, and Zito was trying to go out of his way to make sure like that she didn't see those pages like that, and they had they had changed a version of the script for her, but she didn't get that version. She saw it, but she was like, "Oh, I know, it's okay. I'm the chubby girl." So that version of Jason right here is Savini. He's playing Jason,
right.
and it's actually the only time you see his hands without that makeup. He didn't do his own hands in that makeup, but that was Savini playing it.
That was another one of those little fun facts that I did not know.
Yeah.
Going into researching this film for the episode, that Savini himself actually portrayed Jason in this movie, at least for that scene.
Yeah.
It's something he can say on his resume that he portrayed Jason in one of the first Friday sequels. I think that's awesome.
That Jarvis family hug there was actually something that Cohen's family, the writer,
Barney Cohen?
Yeah, his family actually did. Him growing up, then he did with his kids, so it's like this weird family tradition.
He did a lot in the screenplay with developing like the family dynamics.
Yeah, and a lot of it was based on his own sort of family and stuff. And even, I think this dog was named after a friend of Joseph Zito's who had a beloved dog, Gordon, that passed away. And
the other thing that I think this screenplay does really well, and the movie depicts beautifully, is the expansion of what we know of Crystal Lake. It's something that you didn't really think of in the first three films that becomes like an, oh, of course moment when you realize there are people who live adjacent to Camp Crystal Lake. There are residents of this area. Yeah. It's just something we haven't seen as much.
For the first time, we're not on campgrounds. We're just, kids coming to serve a summer house. And there's a lot to talk about in a weird way. I'll try to condense it with the way the houses are laid out here and what Joseph Zito wanted to do. And it doesn't play well till the end where you see how close they are to one another. The Jarvis house was a real house. He loved it. And so they wanted the other house to be really next door, which is why Jason's able to kind of see and get to everybody. So they built the other house from scratch, the one that these kids are staying in, and it took up a lot of money, a lot of the budget, and they had to keep building it smaller and smaller and smaller because they didn't have a lot of money. But it was a big deal to Zito to have it that way. And I keep thinking about on a small budget, like how much money actually went into just building this house. And as much as he loved the other house, which was a real house for the Jarvis house, all they kept talking about was how hard it was actually to film in there because it was so tight. But he just loved the look of it. So I don't know. That's some odd choices.
It's amazing how much these experienced journeyman directors like Steve Miner or Joseph Zito, or even to a degree Sean S. Cunningham, they were able to get so much bang for so little buck.
Yeah.
And just exactly what you were just describing during this complicated production of Final Chapter, all of that was done under the auspices of sharing, all these department heads sharing essentially a $2 million budget.
Right.
Which even in 1983/84, that's nothing. That's nothing.
And, I think they were playing around with the idea, this mom, the way she stares out the window at those kids.
Yes, and also...
That you might think, just like in the first film, that the mother might end up being sort of the killer for some of these people.
I love that it's something that had never occurred to me in experiencing this movie, that particular potential red herring.
Right.
That would have beautifully tied back to the first movie.
Yeah.
And actually may have tied the first four films together even more elegantly.
And I think that could be a reason why we don't definitively see the mother ever get killed because they're trying to keep you sort of wondering if she's a part of these killings as long as possible. If that was something they were really trying to push. I'm not sure if it's more of a, you can look at it this way, or this was actually something they were playing around with.
Well, I think the casting of Joan Freeman speaks volumes about the style of person they wanted to depict Mrs. Jarvis. Mm-hmm. There is sort of a haunted quality to her portrayal, and also just her physicality to me. Mm-hmm. And you can definitely start to wonder if there's something behind those placid eyes that she has.
Yeah.
And yet, until now, that never really had occurred to me expositionally that, oh, wait, maybe she's a demented killer as well.
Right.
It just, until now. It's interesting. A really quick fun fact of my own, if I might.
Yeah.
The first day of principal photography of this film happened to be Halloween, October 31st of 1983. And after they finished that day of filming, a number of the cast and crew decided to go just into a random neighborhood adjacent to where they were filming and go trick-or-treating.
Well, it was just two of them. It was the girl played his sister, and the guy Rob,
and Corey Feldman,
and took him,
and he dressed as Jason Voorhees.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is, repeatedly bumped into other Jason Voorheeses just out and about trick-or-treating, and was able to suddenly have this realization as a little kid in this filming this fourth movie of just how big this series had become.
Yeah, he hadn't really, I think he says he hadn't really seen any of the Friday the 13th before this. Obviously, he was young, and he actually thought at the auditions that he was going in for one of the Halloween movies.
Right.
And like you were bringing up earlier, like this, I feel like we're finally back shooting somewhere that feels like Crystal Lake from the first movie again. It feels so much like
Crystal Lake to me. Absolutely.
And we're in California. We're in a lot of this is Topanga Canyon. And these are famously the double mint gum twins that one of them had come in to read for just one of these main girls, and then literally during her audition, they find out she has a twin, and Zito's like, whoa.
Yeah, right.
You know what I mean? Like we and she didn't. The one who was initially there wasn't comfortable doing any nudity, but then they bring in the other sister who's like, I don't care, and so she kind of talks the other one into doing nudity too, a little more comfortable with her sister there, and of course they, took advantage of that for this film.
Joe was pointing out to me something kind of funny before we started.
Oh boy.
He was, as I got here to record, Joe was catching up and finishing listening to the Joseph Zito commentary, one of the commentary tracks for Final Chapter. And all I'll say is, you can tell through and through to that very day of recording that commentary, Joseph Zito was an exploitation filmmaker at his heart.
Yeah,
he understood the tenets of exploitation filmmaking and applied them liberally to the Friday the 13th franchise when he had his chance to guide one of the entries in the Final Chapter. And that explosion of aesthetic value sort of colored the rest of the Friday the 13th movies a different way going forward. Mm-hmm. Much more sexuality, much more nudity, sexual content, a connection between sex and death or sex and violence becomes more predominant. And Joseph Zito really seemed to hone in on that based on the career he had as a director and the type of drive-in exploitation and horror films he had cut his teeth on.
Yeah. And this scene, the girls were always planned on, seeing them get nude and jump in. And it was just the actors for the men that decided to, fair is fair, and they take off their clothes and jumped in too. Crispin Glover did not want to take his boxers off. You'll see him start to get in, but he's not taking. And they say it works. It works for his character.
Well, the thing about it is, with the exception of the character of Rob, who hasn't come in yet.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of male beefcake in the Final Chapter.
No.
As there is, you were saying fair is fair. Yeah. I would argue in the previous two sequels, there's much more masculine-looking men to kind of counter the beautiful women.
Yeah.
Okay? It's a lot of nerds for the males in the Final Chapter, with the exception of Rob, who's incredibly masculine.
Yeah. Although
But he's disconnected from this part of the movie.
Peter Barton there, the dude from you were talking about from Matthew
I guess
Star,
that
like,
he
he's
counts.
not really nerdy, but
he's almost more fey.
Yeah.
There is a more of an effeminate quality to him, and I'm not making any suggestions or aspersions. I'm just saying I would not classify Peter Barton as a masculine leading man type. He's a sensitive actor more than anything.
That's why he's sort of
It's like a
ends up
sensitive,
with,
soft-spoken character in two nerds who are competing for world's biggest nerd.
and the same thing with the girls. There's the one girl who that male character ends up with is the more reserved, quieter.
Right.
She doesn't want to go skinny dipping here and stuff.
I guess there are two actors in this film. Obviously, one of them is Crispin Glover.
Yeah.
That went on the following year from this to be in Robert Zemeckis' Back to the Future.
Of course, yeah.
Do you recall who the second actor was from this film that was in Back to the Future? I have it in my notes.
There's a second. I didn't even
Lisa
realize.
Freeman. Now, is she in this movie or a previous sequel? I'm not
I don't see her. Oh, Lisa Freeman's Nurse Morgan earlier. Jeez, I'll have to look.
Okay, that's who she played in this movie?
Yes,
okay.
she was that nurse that in the beginning.
The R.
Yeah,
Morgan
yeah.
name tag. Well, she is in Back to the Future in a very small role.
Okay, yeah.
Obviously, Crispin Glover sort of made his career the next year in Back to the Future.
Crispin Glover just did a great little interview. You should people can look up on YouTube, and he kind of gets into the filming of his scene here and
his dance, right?
Yeah, but even of course, but more so, he tells a great story of just his whole approach, where he was at in life, why he took the role. He didn't really think it's a great movie, or he was kind of just needed work. He had seen the original and equated it to sort of a rip-off of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and so he was like, geez, now I'm doing.
He was close to the target.
Yeah, he's like, now I'm doing the fourth movie of a ripoff. So he really didn't think there was much merit to this, and his approach was just, I'm just gonna go and have fun and make my money and do what I got to do.
Really quick, does this not look like Crystal Lake to you?
Yeah, thank God we're back in a real
We're
lake.
not in a mud puddle anymore.
And the actress who's nude here, the darker haired one, she was in Weird Science. You remember?
Oh, one of my favorite movies. I didn't know
Jesus.
she was in it, but I love that movie.
Yeah, she was one of the two girls like that they end up with, and
Still think that's one of the funniest movies ever
one
made.
of the greatest movies, and
what a genius movie that is, Weird Science. Now, I want to ask you, because he just stepped right into frame, what do you think about Ted White as Jason this time out?
I don't know. It's weird. He's not He's a great Jason. I mean, in terms of just Jason, it's not the slow moving. He thought if this was going to be the last one, we're going out with a bang. Like he runs and grunts and really goes for it,
And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that Ted White was literally 57 years old when he played Jason.
Yeah.
But he was in great shape.
He was. No, he did great.
I like that Corey Feldman and him on this set had very much like a Dennis the Menace and Mr. Wilson relationship.
Yeah.
And I think Ted White, at the time when he was filming, he thought Corey Feldman was like a mean little brat.
Yeah.
But
he says he wanted to just kill him.
But in later years, and also on the inverse, Corey Feldman talks about when he was a child, he was terrified of Ted White.
And he said, I just don't think Ted White knew how to deal with kids as well, in general.
Right.
But,
But in later decades on, Ted White went on to have a further and a deeper understanding of a lot of the kind of horrible treatment that Corey Feldman was in the midst of in his youth, and kind of the odd life he was living. And Ted White grew more of a empathy or sensitivity for what Feldman was probably going through in the early 80s.
And he always did acknowledge, though, that he was surprised at how good of an actor he was.
Yeah, he's always, Ted White has always said that.
His acting was great. He just kind of found him to be bratty. And
I mean, you can see there's
Ted White's a grump, right? I mean, let's face it, if you listen to him. And he famously also got in many arguments with Joe Zito.
Well,
he took his name off the credits. He didn't want to, he was embarrassed by this whole thing.
Ted White sort of became almost like a liaison between the younger actors and the executives, the producers, and even Joseph Zito himself.
Yeah.
Because even though White was looked at more of a stunt performer, he still had an incredibly experienced history as in the Hollywood studio system as a performer.
Yeah.
And he was not going to be bent over by any young upstart whippersnapper director.
Yeah. I mean, I think, in so many movies that are low budget and whatnot, you kind of have to do a little more, just get it done, work hard, just fight through whatever the conditions are. And he saw a lot of that happening with the young people in ways that he felt uncomfortable with and thought people might get hurt and stuff on the set. And he got into, plenty of arguments. And famously, the lake scene with the girl in the raft, he gets in an argument where he knew she had to get out of the water because she was cold, and like Zito snaps back at him something like, why don't you just play Jason and I'll worry about the directing, so they really, it was, that's kind of how it was the whole time,
I think Rob is also potentially meant to clearly be a second potential red herring for this film. Right at that moment where he's gazing almost lovingly into a monster's eyes, to me, it gives me this sense that Zito is trying to give the audience a little bit of leeway in suspecting something darker is going on with Rob.
Right.
Also, it's weird that he sort of just wanders into this kid's bedroom.
I know, like the mom's just like, oh, okay, some guy with
Some
a backpack
random
that has a rifle tied to it and
Who
whatnot.
seems to have a chip on his shoulder for some reason.
All right, let's talk about this scene for a minute.
Okay.
Now, there's the
Very
obvious,
iconic scene.
obvious thing to talk about is Crispin Glover's dance. Yes, this is how he actually danced. This is what you would have seen him doing in clubs that day.
Yeah, but I just wanted to say something about that, just to add to that.
Yeah.
Contextually, you've got to understand something. Everybody that was on this set, they thought Crispin Glover's dancing was like state of the art.
Yeah, well, they thought it was fun and funny. Now, to be fair,
but he would go out and actually do this.
He asked for the song they're dancing to is AC/DC's Back in Black. And if you, again...
on set?
Yep.
Oh.
He asked for Crispin Glover. And if you go online on YouTube, you can look it up, where people have replaced that music.
Oh my God, that's so cool.
When you see it, the dance makes I mean, he says it was always meant to be asynchronic. But when you hear it with that Back in Black song,
it all ties together.
He's a little more in rhythm, and the girl is definitely dancing in rhythm. It makes it all, it fits a little more. So the changing of the song definitely makes it even weirder. But this whole scene, this is what I was talking about earlier with the lighting. This lighting, I don't know why, in my head, all I see is, you remember the Spielberg film 1941?
Oh, of course. One of his first major bomb.
That's all I think of here.
Like in terms of the look?
The look, the softness, the
Well, it's funny because that would have been Dean Cundy who shot Halloween.
The way there's the multiple groups of people interacting, it just all feels, I don't know. It feels a little out of place, but
I have to say that I never thought, ever thought, there would be a Steven Spielberg's 1941 reference during the Friday the 13th season.
Know. It's just
that's
what
just blew my mind.
In my head. I don't know why.
You know what it is? I haven't thought about that movie in years.
If you ever watch that film again, watch how soft the image is.
Oh,
okay?
Yes,
it's
right.
The whole time, and that scene, because now it's not soft. The other thing to
maybe
watch,
because 1941 was meant to have this fantastical quality to it.
Of course. I mean, I'm not sure,
escapist quality to it that blew up in Spielberg's face.
It's also from a time when guys who, like Spielberg and Lucas and all them still had to use the veteran camera guys and lighting guys who had that sort of old school way about them of getting things done and lit, because they were still early directors that didn't have full say in everybody, that they could hire. Anyway, also to watch in this scene is the blue baseball hat.
Okay.
That the other guy is wearing. Zito talks about how it was sort of like his It was very important for him to get that hat in, and it's like a marker of almost having sex? Like, who's lucky?
Oh, God, that's
Because if you
interesting.
watch after
Like the
that...
transfer of the hat?
Yeah, because later Crispin wears it after he has sex.
Okay.
Or right before he's about to. I can't remember.
I love those weird esoteric
Isn't it?
connections. Those
Yeah.
like unplanned,
And this kid
odd
never
connections.
gets the hat because he doesn't, get laid at all during the movie.
He gets something else entirely.
But yeah, just something small to look at there.
I just want to talk for a quick moment about something that has sort of confounded a lot of fans over the years. And we were talking earlier about how the house of cards of logic of some of these movies, how easily, collapsible it can be if you ask questions. So you have the character of Rob, who is out hunting around Crystal Lake because he's so troubled and tormented because his sister has disappeared as potentially one of the victims of Jason Voorhees.
And the sister we're talking about is from part two. The young girl.
That was actually the underage actor who did a nude scene with the producers, not knowing she was actually, I think, 16 at that time.
Marta or something.
Right,
I can't remember.
We'll get it there. But anyway. So if you really break down the timeline,
of course,
it sort of makes no sense because his sister would have disappeared like 36 hours ago.
Yeah.
Right?
Something like
that. Now,
that.
he could ostensibly still be, and yes, I've used ostensibly 4 or 5 times, he could ostensibly still be searching for his missing sister, but he seems much more psychologically troubled, something that would have taken like months or years to set in, like a hopelessness.
Oh, of course. Well, he's got so his whole thing too is that Rob's character was supposed to, all that gear he's carrying around was supposed to be originally scripted to be this high tech, like all these crazy tracking devices that he was using to track Jason. But then the props arrived on set, and Joseph Zito said they looked so bad, so cheap and chintzy.
It's too bad because
that he had to just eliminate that whole storyline.
That is literally like the third potential storyline that didn't end up getting filmed that you've brought up related to this movie that I continuously think would have improved this movie even more.
Yeah, I mean, that would have been a cool,
it would have been some cool character perspective. Plus, it's something we've never seen, is a character that could actually sort of oppose Jason.
Yeah.
See, everyone is always being easily mowed over by Jason.
Yeah.
Having a character that sort of meets Jason on even ground, the way that, like, for example, in another franchise, let's say in the Texas Chainsaw franchise, in the third movie, Leatherface, Ken Foree has this epic fist fight with Leatherface where you actually believe Ken Foree's character could stand up to Leatherface.
Right.
The Friday franchise has never really had that.
Yeah.
And Rob is sort of the closest we come in the first 4 films. So that element would have been absolutely really interesting.
I finally found it in my notes.
Yeah, go ahead.
The girl in the workout video in the beginning is Darcy DeMoss, who went on to have a role in part 6.
Oh, very nice. I'm glad you got back to that.
There we go.
I also want to say this Rob storyline we're talking about was actually reconceived for the Platinum Dunes 2009 Friday the 13th remake, if you want to call it that. Jared Padalecki's character is essentially Rob from this movie.
Well, I always said
he's searching for his missing sister. He's come to Crystal Lake. But in that version of this story element, they develop it differently, and it works like gangbusters, in my opinion, in that Marcus Nispel 2009 movie.
That's the great thing about that remake, is that they are able to go at it without having to like getting the timelines right.
That's exactly right.
Where this movie, again, like, and Zito talks about, he realized now after how weird it is that Rob was looking for his sister, sort of like, if you
like literally 36 hours after she was killed.
And so, isn't there supposed to be a year at some point? Isn't there supposed to be a year gap between like 2 and 3? Or no? No, because they're watching the news report.
Yeah, sure. You guys at home,
you're right.
If you guys
I think you're right. It's only been like a few days or something.
I think it has only been a few days or even hours. And if you know anything about in the real world, it takes like over 24 hours to even get law enforcement to operate on the notion that there's a missing person.
I think I'm thinking of the 5-year gap that's like between 1 and 2, but anyway.
I'm not sure. But in terms of the sequels from 2 through 4, I think it's a matter of days.
You just got to kind of roll with it. At least
there is a dip in time between 1 and 2.
Right.
But from 2 through 3 into 4, it's like a pretty much a straightforward run.
And this is the scene where this girl, like, she actually ended up with hypothermia. Ted White had to insist on her getting out and getting warmed up at some point, and she did end up with hypothermia.
The actor who Ted White had that major argument with Joseph Zito over?
That's the scene right there.
That's the scene. Because
they were really in the lake. So this whole movie.
So Ted White was saying to Joseph Zito, you shouldn't be putting this actor through what is basically inhuman conditions.
There was a point where she asked to get out because she was cold as they were like between takes, and Zito said, "No, we need to keep going." And Ted White said, "No, she needs to get out. She's shivering. She's everything else," and basically threatened to just sort of stop working, if he continued, and they had the argument. But he won, like Ted White, and the actress got out and warmed up, finished the scene. But see, there goes the hat. But she did end up with hypothermia. Was very sick for a few days afterwards.
That hat thing is a really interesting, strange, esoteric connection. I'm glad you brought that up. I'm paying more attention to it now, and it's interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I have to say, all through my life experience with the Friday the 13th films, if somebody had ever asked me, well, who's your favorite Jason? I've always said Final Chapter, Ted White. And I still really love what Ted White brings to Jason. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't until preparing for these episodes over the past few months, getting to really deep dive into Richard Brooker from part 3, that I have come to more of an understanding that, in my opinion now, I think it really starts and ends with Richard Brooker.
So for me, it's like two people. You got the living Jason, which is my favorite. Would be
of course,
Richard
I'm
Brooker.
Talking about these first 4 films,
and then once we get,
of course, Kane Hodder,
and then we have. I feel like Kane Hodder is sort of like my other guy. When you have that more
clearly
slimy, just dead Jason.
The first person people will always associate when they hear the name Jason Voorhees, I guarantee you, will always be Kane Hodder. But again, sometimes, like we've said many, many times on Haddonfield Radio, you guys know, you connect nostalgically to a certain movie or a certain performance because it connects to a happy time in your life. And when I have always thought of the Friday the 13th films, I've always the one that always comes to mind is the Final Chapter. But do I now think it's the best of the first 4 films? I'm not sure because I think now the first 4 films really feel like one long movie to me.
Can I tell you, I really don't like that the Jason's hands in this.
That I was discussing earlier,
like
those
the way
decrepit-looking dead hands.
First of all, it looks a little makeup-y, but
okay.
If he was in the dead form, like you wouldn't care. It just seems sort of out of nowhere. All of a sudden, he's got these crazy hands. After the other 3 movies, they're just normal hands.
But do you see what I mean, though, when I bring up this idea that, to me, he almost appears that he's already dead?
Yeah. But I think, unfortunately, they do those little signs early on with, like, the breath and the hand moving. It's those classic, he's alive.
Okay, yet I would argue, if you wanted to, again, bringing back Kane Hodder, especially in his performance, one of the hallmarks of Kane Hodder's performance as Jason to me is that the shoulders rising and falling, the breathing. So that's why I always classify post-life Jason as more of a revenant.
There's definitely an argument that he could
in a state of living death.
Yes, it could be already happening here. I personally just think
I'm
this
just
is
playing
supposed
devil's
to be...
advocate.
I think he's... I mean, the filmmakers were trying to have this big ending where they actually killed Jason, right? So I think the implication is that he hasn't actually been dead yet before the end of this movie.
Oh, I completely agree with that.
Getting it in the crotch. Oh, and you can see the cables and the smoke behind it.
Think about it. Jason sort of has grown a taste for attacking the crotch.
Yeah.
He did it so memorably in part 3 when he bisected that guy standing on his head.
Yeah.
And now he goes at it here. And also, don't forget, symbolically, what is Jason attacking? Sexual imagery. Mm-hmm. He's attacking sexual symbolic material. So there's something that can be said for that.
Fun fact, one of Zito's notes to Cohen, the writer, he says, don't think of any new ways to kill the kids, because people have seen everything. Just make them like your after-school special kids, and whatever we do to them will be horrific. So that's why these guys are they're playing them a little extra, I think, I mean, they're obviously not innocent, but they just a little more, I don't know, happy-go-lucky sort of bunch of kids, you know?
You know, lighting nighttime, especially in a wooded, moonlit area, is so tricky because, of course, you have, as an audience, you have to see everything that's being depicted, but it still has to look dramatic and aesthetically pleasing. I think this sequence here looks great. What do you think? The lighting?
Well, yeah, of course. And you add they're adding some smoke, and you can really create an atmosphere. I mean, obviously, so they're implying Jason has been through here and ransacked this guy's tent.
I like the idea that the gun is literally destroyed.
Yeah.
Because it is
he's not going to use that.
It is not it's almost like Jason has made a philosophical decision not to use any range weaponry. Jason wants to be up close and personal where he can profit his massive physicality as a weapon in and of itself.
Although part 3 does shoot that spear gun.
Oh my God! Yeah. And that's actually absolutely right.
But
and that's one of the best deaths in part 3. And I love the way he just just drops the gun to the ground like he could care less. You got me there. You're absolutely right. You got me there. I have to admit. You know, I wanted to say earlier, only I just couldn't think of the detail of this point I wanted to make. The Tommy Jarvis's bedroom. I think all of those masks were created by one of the effects artists on this film. I want to say it was John Vulich.
I read it was like a combo of all the effects guys. Like everyone just sort of brought in stuff they had.
Because I'm almost positive you see Fluffy's mechanical architecture.
Oh, you might, of
on
course.
That on Tommy Jarvis's desk.
Yeah.
I was just curious. Anybody out there? Do you guys know if that is Fluffy's mechanical face that's on the Tommy Jarvis's table? I love Fluffy. I have a huge soft spot in my heart for Fluffy from Creepshow, so I'm just curious.
And the kid who was getting stoned, the one who doesn't get lucky at all here, that actor, which is
Lawrence Monason.
Yes, he actually was like, "Hey, let me." My character's supposed to be stoned in this scene, and so let me try actually getting stoned when and
boy, can you see it?
Yeah, and he said he wasn't a smoker, and it made him very paranoid and kind of hard for him to comprehend all the direction give it to him, and he really regretted.
I saw him talking somewhere where he assumed that getting stoned was very similar to drinking, like getting drunk.
You just kind of loosen up.
You don't, it just, deteriorates your ability to do normal things in a way if you're not used to it, especially film a major motion picture.
Yeah.
And you can see it in his eyes. You can really see it in his eyes.
Yeah. And in the very beginning when you see that hockey mask and the explosion and
one
all
of
that,
my favorite kills in the entire franchise,
even though you don't see anything, it's all done
lightning strike silhouette.
Yeah.
Actually, ironically enough, to me, when I was watching it again, catching up, I was like, that looks like a Steve Miner shot.
Oh, yeah.
Doesn't it?
Sure.
But I love it. I think it's extremely creative.
So in the beginning, the hockey mask and the explosion and all that, originally Zito wanted the mask was supposed to explode into a bunch of pieces. But the effects house and stuff, they just didn't have the money to really pull it off. He just kind of got what they did.
I can almost imagine
he wasn't really happy with that.
How Savini would have designed that exploding mask practicality.
Yeah,
I can actually imagine in my mind how he might do that. Well, I'll give you this. Peter Barton, you would see his face everywhere, it feels like, in the 80s. Doesn't he have that, as an actor, the face? Don't you remember seeing him everywhere?
Yeah.
Especially probably on TV.
I'm sure he was on a lot of stuff.
Probably on a lot of episodic TV. I'll have to look into it. He just has that extremely... He looks sort of like one of the Osmonds to me. Like Donny Osmond or something.
Yeah. Kind of reminds me of the guy who would go on to play one of the original Shazam, I feel like.
Oh my God! Right? Is it him?
I don't know. Is it?
Wait a minute.
I think I would have seen that in our research, and not just whatever that show, Powers of Matthew Starr. I think they would have mentioned Shazam, too.
Well, if it's not him, whoever was in Shazam definitely looks like him.
Right? Yeah.
That's another thing I got to make a mental note. I got to look. Do you guys know who was that actor from Shazam? Let us know in the comment section. I used to love that show.
So this house, the Jarvis house, was also used later as the Anderson home in the film Ed Gein from 2000. This is where
Wait, this set was used in
it wasn't a set. This is a real house.
This
the Jarvis
house was used in that later film,
It was
the Ed Gein film?
Yep.
With Steve
scene
Railsback?
where he is apprehended. This is the same house. And Joseph Zito returned to this house way years later when he was doing like the commentary tracks. I want to say maybe 2009. And he said, if you look around that house, there are still marks in the walls from the machete and what they did when they were filming Friday the 13th.
I just checked it to make sure I was right. And in fact, yes, Steve Railsback did play Ed Gein in that 2000 film. One of the weirdest actors of all time. If you really want to see one of the weirdest performances of all time, and you haven't seen Tobe Hooper's Life Force, Steve Railsback is the lead in that movie, and it is an ostentatiously bizarre performance. And I love it. Don't get me wrong. Absolutely adore Life Force.
So the main girl, Trish, this woman's daughter, she, I guess like over the years really, I don't know, kind of gave this movie a little shade where like she said it wasn't even a B movie, it was more like a C movie, right?
And that doesn't really track because this movie was a massive success. Not only did it have a $12 million opening, it went on to gross $33 million.
I mean,
it's amazing.
She just said she wasn't a fan at all of horror films. And
I find it sad when people who take part in these iconic things can't derive any attachment or love for it. It's too bad.
I mean, think about the fact that Ted White was so... Like, it was such a bad experience, and he was almost embarrassed. He was happy he was under makeup so no one knows him. Like, his name isn't in the credits. He didn't want to be credited.
Listen, this is a guy who had doubled Rock Hudson, Clark Gable, John Wayne. He was on A-list movie sets for most of his career.
He told Zito during production, like, this is a piece of shit, Like, he literally said that to the director,
And I know he came around over the decades.
He did.
When he started experiencing the Friday fan culture, Ted White really took to that.
He said he was offered part 5 and 6, but he said no, and he regretted it later, but,
I think that was probably for the best, though.
Yeah.
As much as I love and respect Ted White. Look, when I say Ted White has always been my favorite Jason, I say it the same way Tom Baker has always been my Doctor Who. It just is a time and place thing. But as we've been going through these first 4 movies for Haddonfield Radio, I still have to say I've been so continuously blown away by the legacy of Richard Brooker again on part 3.
Yeah.
And I love a lot of the nuance Ted White added to what Richard Brooker brought to Jason. Certainly, I think Ted White brings a little bit more intellectual cunning and a little bit more quicker physicality or more intense physicality. But yeah, they're both neck and neck in my mind. They're both extraordinary Jasons. Let's just say that.
Fun little Ted White story was that when he finished his scenes for this film, he immediately went to go work on Starman. Remember?
Oh, wow.
Carpenter,
yes,
Jeff,
of course.
So, and then during that, a bunch of reporters were coming to interview Carpenter, and then he decided he couldn't do the interview for whatever reason, and he said to Ted White, hey, you go out there and talk to him about your new film, the other film you just did.
Oh, wow.
And so he did, and then because of that, a bunch of reporters ended up, because the movie was still being filmed,
right?
They went and did a bunch of press on Friday the 13th instead,
Huh. It's amazing when you really stop to think of where Corey Feldman went from here. Is that not an unbelievable trajectory?
I mean, this same year,
he's
Gremlins
still in pop culture now in 2025.
Think about being that kid, and like he had Gremlins.
Gremlins was out the same year.
A few months later, Gremlins comes out. He talks about it was just a really crazy, fun time in his youth.
Here's a movie I had forgotten he's in, and he's really, really good in it. The Burbs.
Right. Oh, yeah, I remember that.
I caught up with that movie like
Yeah.
a year or so ago just because I hadn't watched it. First off, boy, does it hold up. It's still so good. It's still got to be one of Tom Hanks' best roles as a sleeper. But I'm going to tell you, Corey Feldman is a riot in The Burbs. He's one of the best characters in that movie.
Henry Gibson, right?
Yeah.
Good stuff.
Such
Carrie
a good movie.
Fisher
Oh
is
my God, yes.
The wife, one of her few
it's an
non-Star Wars
awesome
roles.
movie. And strangely enough, and I guess not strangely enough, sadly, they're remaking The Burbs right now
No
as a
way.
television series.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's too bad.
They just can't think of any new ideas.
No.
Huh?
And they just want to continue ruining old ones. God, honest to God. And Crispin Glover is another one. A movie Crispin Glover is in around this period that I absolutely love is Tim Hunter's River's Edge.
River's Edge. I was just
Oh
bring it
my
up,
God!
right? Yeah.
An early Keanu Reeves performance, Joshua Miller in an early one
Heavy
of his
movie.
great performances. Dustin Hopper, Dennis Hopper is in it, and he's amazing. If you guys haven't seen, and Tim Hunter is a fascinating director. He made this incredible debut film, River's Edge, and then sort of disappeared for 30 years. And now he directs television and some films here and there, but he was one of the brightest. He was like, people thought they were seeing like a Quentin Tarantino, even though Quentin Tarantino hadn't occurred yet, but that type of like a voice in film. I also noticed 1984, The Never-Ending Story.
Yeah. Oh God, I love that freaking movie.
There are two movies that absolutely devastated me when I was a kid. The first of the two movies is definitely E.T. I had to be literally carried out of the movie theater by my father. I was so traumatized by the ending of that movie.
Yeah.
And the other one was The Never-Ending Story.
Yeah.
When that horse went down into the mud of the nothing, it shattered everything I knew in my childhood about like peace and tranquility.
Yeah.
I was traumatized.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, of course.
Never-Ending Story is a dark movie.
It is. But, it's the classic, kid who doesn't fit in, which is kind of what Corey Feldman's also playing here. He's wearing masks and making special effects.
Yeah, you don't see him any other kids.
It's going to be the kid, like, the audience is going to relate to that type of character more. You know what I mean?
And I know when they were crafting the screenplay, Zito, Hideki Sadao, and Barney Cohen, the studio was worried about the fact that the central character of this film was going to be a child.
Yeah.
And centering a film of this nature, this dark adult nature, around a child, there was a lot of conjecture about the responsibility of that. Even putting a child actor into these types of filmic situations was looked at as potentially being controversial.
They did all the things you're not supposed to do in filmmaking. A, work with child actors. B, have animals. And C, rain.
Yeah, anything involving water.
And they did all three of them.
They've got a lake. They've got rain.
Yeah. And Crispin Glover's death there with the hatchet to the face. Do you remember, like, I think it was part 3, when I brought up that the reference to that movie, Anthropophagus. Remember I had that same
neither of us
thing?
could pronounce that weird.
Well, supposedly
cult
this
movie.
is yet another reference. That was yet another reference to that movie.
What? Okay, well, I've got to check out Anthropophagus.
That's what I'm saying. Like, I got to see what this movie is.
And I truly hope it is called Anthropophagus.
Yeah.
Because I love that. I've got to check this thing out. I've never even heard of this until last episode.
Well, apparently it was big to all the filmmakers
Apparently
in the early 80s.
these guys, they were all into it.
Yeah.
I'm surprised, and I'm not saying anything negative about the actor who plays Rob's subsequent career. He really does have a movie star look, doesn't he?
Yeah.
I'm sort of surprised he didn't have a bigger, more household name type career.
Yeah.
Because, look at him. He's very handsome.
Yeah.
I might even throw him on my crush list. You know what I'm going to do, just for fairness and because we're in the 2020s and it's culturally appropriate, I'm going to throw Rob and the actor that plays him, I'm going to throw both of them on my crush list.
So, you want to hear the story? Remember, I told you I was going to bring it up during his death scene, but it might be a lot to bring up that quickly.
Rob's death scene? Oh, I can't wait to talk about that.
Well, we'll go ahead and talk about what you thought was so horrifying about it.
I know I've seen this movie, The Final Chapter, like 50 times in my life.
Yeah.
But when I watched this movie getting ready to make this episode, one of the aspects of this film that I found the most frightening, the most disturbing and unsettling, is Rob's death scene. Mm-hmm. When he is repeatedly screaming, "He's killing me! He's killing me!" It caused goose flesh to erupt on my arms, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. And I've watched this movie 50 times. It just really got to me. So I quickly started Googling about that death scene. And what I was so surprised to find is that a lot of fans find that scene almost laughable as a kill. Mm-hmm. I think it is horrific. I think the way the actor E. Eric Anderson plays it, it's very disturbing to me. Somebody screaming, "He's killing me," like the idea that you are experiencing your own murder in real time.
Mm-hmm. Well,
terrifying.
So that whole scene, all that was done on purpose by Zito. They did have a more elaborate death plan for him. They had even built some weapons, fake pitchforks and things with blood and all that he was going to attack him with, but in the end they didn't even use them. And by the way, that actress in the shower is a body double for the actual actress in that scene because she didn't want to get nude.
Yep. Fair enough.
Anyway, so Zito had read an article in the New York Times about the real-life murder of Kitty Genovese, who was stabbed in the middle of the night while walking to her apartment. And the article claimed that 38 neighbors heard her scream. This is a
very famous story.
Heard her scream, "Oh my God, he's stabbing me, he's killing me." But no one did anything to help her.
I never connected that kill with that true murder.
Coincidentally, the murder occurred on Friday, March 13th, 1964.
Okay. I have to say, every single episode so far of season 3, one place or another in each of the episodes, you've absolutely blown my mind. That just blew the top of my head off.
Yeah.
Because that Kitty Genovese murder is one of the most it's one of the first examples of the cultural appropriation of the idea of true crime as almost entertainment.
Right.
That telling of that story. All these people witnessed it, no one responded, no one helped. Mm-hmm. And what it really speaks to, whether the true story is exactly as it is the idea that humans were becoming less empathetic to the plight of other humans, especially at the time when the slasher movies were in their prime period.
Well, and so exactly. So Zito intended for it to be like really gut wrenching. I
found it so deeply unsettling. Rob's death.
That's why he kind of tries to establish that Rob is actually a capable opponent of Jason.
Exactly. Yes. Yes.
But then he kind of realized after the way it was shot, and which is what they did, is it kind of came off that he seemed more pathetic and weak, making Jason appear merciless.
Okay, but here's what I would... Oh, my God.
And that's what makes the audience usually burst out laughing. You know?
But don't you get it, though? That's the thing. Not you. I'm saying that person, devil's advocate.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. Yes, the whole movie, you're positioned to see Rob as this masculine character, perhaps certainly the most masculine character in the film. If they had used that idea of him with all these weapons he was going to use preparing to fight Jason, when he finally gets to that crescendo where he's going to face Jason, and Jason just mows through him with no effort, what it does is it just reinforces how supremely unbeatable Jason is. Mm-hmm. Like, you've been led down the red herring road of thinking Rob was going to be able to stand up to Jason. Yeah. Rob was never going to be able to stand up to Jason.
Nobody really
No one can stand up to Jason because Jason, even the Grim Reaper, cannot stand up to Jason. That actually, the whole Rob death actually, to me, reinforces Jason's supremacy, right?
Yes. Can I tell you when my heart stopped a second ago when the lights went off in this scene? Because while we were filming this
let's
episode,
tell them what just happened.
The power went out in the middle of us doing our episode.
For the first time in 26 episodes.
It came right back on. Obviously, we're going again. But
we're in the middle of recording the commentary, and the power went out here, and we were in total darkness in Joe's basement.
But when the light just went out in the bathroom, I literally jumped a little because I thought the light said everything had just gone off again.
We literally thought we lost the entire fan commentary. I wanted to frickin' cry.
No.
And Joe, in all of his technical wizardry, immediately was able to recover all the recording and all the data, and we have continued on. And if we hadn't mentioned it, you never would have even knew it had happened, that there was a major interruption in the middle of this fan commentary.
Except you hear me go, every time the lights go off in the movie.
And Joe obviously now has PTSD from it, clearly.
So, this girl, did you, did you ever wonder if she is going to end up being the final girl?
Well, right now they are clearly positioning her at the beginning of what I would call like the final girl speed run.
Yes, but also like throughout the whole movie, she's a little separated from everybody else. She's
which
a little
is
different,
always
right?
the story of the final girl.
So it's like, and I mean, obviously.
But don't you see? This is why I keep saying why I think Joseph Zito's direction is actually quite nuanced. He just led you down the road of thinking she's going to be the final girl, and as soon as your mind catches up with that thought, boom, Jason kills you or kills her.
Yeah.
At this point, Joseph Zito is directing this film in a way that is slyly making Jason this antagonist that none of these characters will ever escape.
Right.
But again, like we're going to see Rob's death. We got a little ahead of ourselves talking about Rob's death.
I just want to be able to tell
Rob's
that story
death
before we see it, so you can really have the impact.
Glad. I'm so glad because I just realized that whole moment with that actress coming down the stairs, you think she's going to be the final girl, and boom, she takes the axe to the chest. Yeah. It's another one of these Joseph Zito sort of red herrings. He's really good at that.
He's giving you two. Like, you do wonder if Trish is the final girl, but also the other girl seems like she's going to be a final girl. So, and then you got the kid in the middle of it all that you got to go, is he going to kill this kid? You know what I mean? Because you're used to there not being a lot of survivors. No,
I think if you were in a movie theater on opening night in April 13th, 1984, and you were sitting in the theater watching this on the first night and you knew nothing about it, I would say you can't have any safety in feeling that, they're not going to kill Corey Feldman's character because he's a kid.
Right.
I think the Friday movies, the first three, have capably built into their audience that no one is safe. They'll go there if they have to. Jason, he's not a mission-oriented killer. He's a killer of brutality. He kills everyone and anyone in his radius.
Mm-hmm. That last shot outside was like the only shot that really establishes how close these houses are together after.
Yeah, it's almost like a little neighborhood in a way.
Well, it was like something that Zito really wanted, this idea that they were really right there next to one another when they were shooting, but you don't really get that. You can't really see that except for that one shot.
You know what occurred to me when I was watching this movie again this month?
Yeah.
Just like maybe I would have done something different in part 3 when Mrs. Voorhees jumps out of the water, I would have had her actually jump out of the water. It's not a dream.
Yeah.
In this one, what might have been interesting is if we saw more of the town that's adjacent to Crystal Lake, more homes, almost like a little suburban neighborhood, to see Jason interacting with a quiet suburban neighborhood as the crescendo of the fourth movie. Mm-hmm. That might have been cool, right?
Yeah.
Seeing Jason like sort of in an amplified landscape of victims.
So there was the alternate ending, which was supposed to be a dream, but
I don't really know much about that.
Trish is on the couch at the end. It's daytime the next morning, but then she starts noticing water dripping from upstairs. Her worried that it's still Jason doing stuff. She, slowly goes upstairs, and in the bathroom, in the tub under the water, she finds her mom, who is dead. And when she lifts the mom up, the mom's eyes open, and they're completely white, which is really creepy looking.
But don't you see?
This is on the box set. You can watch the scene.
It's another mother who's being supernaturally resurrected out of water.
Yeah, exactly.
Why don't they... All of these... ideas that they threw away are some of their best ideas.
And then the idea that they clearly are trying to, at the end with seeing, Tommy Jarvis still alive and the weird look in the eyes and all that, the writers or Cohen, I believe, sort of the idea was that is, sort of like a Halloween anthology idea. It was like now the idea was that evil would spread
to the next,
from one person to another. Wouldn't even stay with Tommy
they actually
necessarily.
End up exploring in Jason Goes to Hell.
Yeah,
they explore that exact concept.
Yeah. So, there's a lot of different things they were thinking about for the ending.
Do you agree with me though that some of these deleted ideas and unused sequences are some of the most fascinating, interesting ideas?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And some of them really do even expand the mythology and creative in new dynamic ways. Mm-hmm. That sequence with the mother coming up out of the bathtub, that is somehow...
It's creepy.
It's connectively emulating the past, but in a new context. It's so neat.
I keep thinking, if you see it, like when she opens her eyes and the white eyes, like the makeup and the water's all murky. I gotta
check that out.
Like it feels better than what the rest of the movie is. It looks scarier than almost the rest of the movie.
It really sounds so creepy.
I don't know if that makes sense, but it's creepy, yeah.
I love that little drawing in the newspaper of the child version of Jason.
Yeah.
It reminds me in a way of the scratchy drawing that Dr. Loomis creates of Michael Myers that you see on the wall at the beginning of Halloween H2O. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
It has that same vibe.
This actress who plays Trish, Kimberly Beck, she had all these strange things happening to her while filming this movie. She would notice a man watching her when she'd run through the park. She'd get strange phone calls. And then as soon as production ended, they all stopped.
It's weird because in my intro, I'm talking about art imitating life, imitating art.
Yeah.
First off, that is a very spooky fun fact.
Yeah.
That whole thing, whether it's a narrative that has been created just to kind of goose up her participation, or it actually happened, if that actually happened, that is almost like supernaturally creepy.
Yeah.
It's almost like Jason was like manifesting in real reality through the traumas she was imagining and to endure in the movie.
And there it is.
Oh my God. It's also in his acting, like the look on his... I don't know, man. He thought as a character that he was going to be able to face Jason.
Right.
Because he thought he was ultimately just going to be facing a man.
Right.
Regardless of how many people he believes Jason has murdered, he still is hunting a man.
Right.
He doesn't understand that there's something else to Jason. And Jason mows through him like summer grass.
And, so the machete thing, when they were thinking about different ways to actually kill Jason off, they were told, this is it. We're going to kill him. So I think, and one of the first ideas was like to literally behead him, like to cut the head right off. And then the studio was like, no, let's not go that far. And that's when they started being like, these guys are going to make another. But Savini wanted to...
This is a great one.
Do this whole thing with the microwave.
Yeah, I love it. It's actually almost complicated to the point of being obscure.
You were going to see earlier in the film that Tommy Jarvis was like taking apart
like
microwaves.
Like a bit of a technical wizard like Joe.
And he was going to like build this little contraption that you would see him melting his like little plastic army men with. And that, fast forward to the end of the movie with Jason, he was going to throw this device on Jason's head and make his head fry and explode everywhere.
Well, Savini wanted to do the ultimate head explosion.
Right, yeah.
And if you actually watch Joseph Zito's The Prowler, one of the most iconic exploding heads in movie history is actually in that film, orchestrated by Savini. Savini even plays the assailant, shotgun blast through a windshield to the head, and it is one of the most grotesque, violent, and brutal head explosions I think ever on film. I actually prefer that head explosion to even the one in Scanners that was in the Cronenberg Scanners.
Yep. And then I think one of the stories I read was, while Savini's trying to sort of figure out what they should actually do for the ending, it was like there was some other people in the shop, and they actually picked up the machete from his Dawn of the Dead or one of the zombie films.
Okay.
Okay, and was like, oh well, it worked in that, and then that's when he had the idea of it falling on.
That's very Savini.
And I think so. I think they're implying that the actual machete we see in this film is the same machete used
wow,
in
I'm gonna have to look into that.
Yeah, I can't believe I didn't write down
That's really freaking cool.
which zombie film it was, but it was obviously one of the Romero ones.
I mean, Jason is at his Kool-Aid Man best in this movie. There is not a door on any hinge that is safe from Jason. He has not met a doorknob he has ever tried.
And Corey Feldman talks about when he comes through that
These
glass,
doors are probably unlocked.
Yeah, well, and when he bursts through the window and grabs Corey, and you see Corey scream and freak out, he said that was totally real.
I used to have that toy, that sort of like lion dragon.
Really, it's so weird.
I used to have that exact toy.
That thing has been like that sticking out to me every time I watch this movie. I wondered if I had it.
He has two of them on his shelf.
I can't remember.
I cannot think of what it was, what series it was from, that toy line, or what it was adapted from, whether it was a cartoon or what. But I vividly remember that toy. Looks sort of like that Gorgon there. If somebody out there knows what that toy you keep seeing on that shelf with the orange chest, what that was from in the early 80s, please let me know, because I don't even know how to Google that. Here comes the Kool-Aid Man.
It's amazing how much he actually uses an axe throughout, at least these first few films. The machete hasn't become really a staple yet, It gets in his hands a lot, but...
Can I ask you a completely unrelated question?
Yeah.
It's me on one of my quick tangents.
Oh, boy.
Did the Kool-Aid Man go, hey, 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 when he broke through a wall? Is that what he said? Did he talk? Did the Kool-Aid Man talk? I feel like in my mind I see the Kool-Aid Man, the big red Kool-Aid Man.
Yeah.
He comes through a wall and he goes, hey, hey, hey.
Wasn't that Fat Albert? Hey.
Oh my God! Am I confusing Fat Albert with
the Fat Albert
If I
show.
am in fact confusing Fat Albert with the Kool-Aid Man, then for some reason I think I'm about to be canceled. I don't know why, but someone's going to find a way to cancel me for that misappropriation of knowledge.
I'll renew you for you.
I'm telling you,
I'm
pretty sure and I think it would have been cool as an homage to those iconic commercials, as on that last bust through the door, if Jason had just gone, hey, hey, hey. No? Would that have been a step too far?
Oh, we've lost him, folks. We've lost him.
This is a part Joe will be clearly editing.
And then the old, we got to step over the villain that we think is dead. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know what? I think we already missed it. It was great. There's the point where he throws the hammer at the wall, and it's clearly on a guide wire, because when it sticks to the wall, it's just like the flat side of the hammer. It's not even the claw.
Like it was attracted by a magnet.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's just going down a wire.
But you know what? Like we always say, I love those little DIY homemade moments, because Joe and I, who have both tried to make films in our life, that's like the nuts and bolts of it, is trying to just solve these little problems. Yeah. And I love seeing creative ways people do it. I'll have to say this. It's always interesting when you're recording these commentaries. It's a completely different way of watching the movie, because you're yapping through the whole thing and you're staying focused and following what's going on the screen. But one thing I always notice is I really become extremely attentive to the kind of flow of the movies, and you can feel when certain things drag, or it's like watching a movie or a TV show with the sound off.
Yeah.
And you can see the editing.
Yeah.
And you can feel the rhythms. Sometimes movies, when you're filming the commentary, they feel twice as long as they actually are. I would say on the opposite, though, the Friday movies, they feel very quick. They flow very quickly to me when we're recording these. I always feel like I'm racing to get everything in that I've got in my notes.
In this movie, just like, some of the earlier ones, had a tough time with the MPAA and all the death scenes. They
Jack
had
Valenti
to cut almost all of them down.
Jack Valenti at the MPAA, he really, like Roger Ebert and Gene Siskel, he had a real axe to grind with these movies in general. This type of horror, this type of visceral, brutal horror, that was seen as anti-woman, that was seen as just having no progressive, important or lasting quality or meaning or value. They were looked at as junk food.
And so what Zito...
And they are not.
What Zito and the editor did was, they basically sacrificed most of the earlier deaths in this movie so that they didn't have to touch Jason's end death that much.
Oh, yeah, right.
Because it really lingers on
what
that
a
shot.
gnarly wound this is.
I know.
This has got to be one of the worst wounds in the whole franchise, in my opinion.
Yeah.
When you stop and you think about what that would feel like, is so disturbing. And I saw a couple cool behind-the-scenes photos you can find out there in Google of how Savini was filming that shot, holding this fake prosthetic arm in hand. It's really, really cool. And you can see on Savini's face in those photos that even he thought it was gnarly.
This girl's holding her own against him.
Hey, she's doing a lot better than Rob did. Think about it. She's actually doing a lot better than Rob did.
Oh, God, yeah.
Something that...
Well, he's got down to one hand and no weapons, but,
Something that occurred to me when I was looking at this again. I'm looking at the design they give Corey Feldman, this iconic design where he's trying to look like Jason did as a child.
Bald cap,
Doesn't
by the
he...
way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Doesn't he look like the character of... like a child version of the character of Chop Top from Texas Chainsaw 2 that Savini was connected to.
Yeah, I can see that.
And John Vulich, I think, did a number of the effects on Texas Chainsaw 2. And the look is so similar to me.
Corey was also very sick.
He was.
During this scene.
He was almost. They thought they might have to hospitalize him. He had a very high fever.
Yep, and I think at the end when he's actually hitting him over and over again.
Oh, look at this mug.
You can see it in his eyes that he's sick.
But going back, I don't know about you, but even as a grown man, when I'm sick with a fever, I can't do anything. Imagine going and filming the crescendo of a movie.
So supposedly, one of the other stories I read was that Corey and Joseph Zito also had a kind of a tumultuous time on this.
Yeah, I've read that.
Corey hated him so much that he imagined... when he was hitting sandbags with the machete here, and he was picturing it as Joe Zito when he was hitting those sandbags. But look at that.
You know what? Her reaction to what just happened really sells it too.
Yeah.
The slide down the machete. What can we say about that hasn't already been said? One of the most iconic moments in horror history, easily. One of the greatest moments in any of these movies. And you truly do think, look, if anything can kill Jason, that has to be it.
Yeah.
You just literally took the top of his head off.
Yeah. And, the movie's the final chapter. I think, and obviously the way they end this with Corey, you feel like, there's a setup for more, but it's not with Jason. Although we get a little twitch, don't we? Yeah.
Yeah, well, you got to do that.
The death twitch.
I love reading anecdotally where there was a point midway through the production where Savini started to dawn on him. The context clues around him started to make him aware that there really was no real idea to end this series. That the final chapter motif was simply being used as a marketing ploy. A very clever, a really, really smart marketing ploy, but a ploy nonetheless.
Which would have been great if they did continue it without Jason, or tried to do the Tommy thing, or this passing on of evil somehow. If they did it well.
You know how going back to episode 23, the Friday the 13th, 1980 episode, we talk a lot about who created Jason. I just find it so interesting when you look at that question through the prism of the final chapter, this movie. That quote that you always hear Savini talking about. I created this monster and I wanted to return to kill him. Of course, I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah.
But that notion, where right there you have Savini clearly asserting his creative control over this character.
Yeah.
And after even 4 movies, looking at these movies, these first 4 movies as one era of Jason's story, I think Savini is really the all-star of this. And even though he wasn't there for half of these movies, He loomed over all of them.
He set the bar that
That's exactly right.
Everybody else had to meet, and everyone else's work had to sort of fit in that same.
It's like, regardless of how
palette.
Savini feels about his history with the Friday franchise as time has gone on and as he's aged and his opinions may have changed and changed again, he will always inextricably be linked with what we visualize when we think of Jason Voorhees. And I think that's for the best.
Yeah. It's too bad that his buddy from the first movie, Tazo, couldn't be here on this one, but
I don't know about you, but I think these 4 Friday the 13th films, these first 4 Friday the 13th films, Era 1, The Life of Jason Voorhees, I think it works like gangbusters. You can see some of the weaknesses, and here and there's problems, but when you look at it from like look above at a whole as a 4-film series, I think it's pretty damn good.
Oh, it's a great film. Yeah, it's solid. It's doing its own thing at times. It's not totally in the same mold that the other 3, were definitely in.
Look at this. I just noticed executive consultant on Final Chapter, Terry Ballard.
There you go.
Another veteran of the Friday franchise lore. I don't know. I had a blast. I've been having the greatest time of my life going through this season 3 journey through the super iconic Friday the 13th series. And what about you?
Oh, God, yeah. Oh, these are so much fun. I'm learning so much.
That's the thing, like you said earlier.
I'm becoming like a really big fan of them,
Yeah, my fandom has been growing movie by movie as I've been deep diving through these movies and gearing up for more and trying to understand what comes later and what informed these films and what films these movies informed. It's just such a fascinating franchise, and I'm so glad we have so many more films still to talk about in this journey.
Getting into making these ads that we've been doing.
Yeah, we've been having so much fun.
Trying to do riffs off of each movie, and the artwork by Mike.
Oh my God. Can we just say,
Mike Hatfield,
kudos, Mike, sir. Every episode, as you guys have been following along, you might have noticed, every episode, the marketing for each episode, the art is done by, of course, the inimitable Mike Hatfield. And I have to say, personally, for the first 4 episodes, the artwork he created for this episode, not only is it my favorite of the 4, I think it's actually one of the scariest images of Jason I've ever seen.
Yeah, it's great.
I think it's a brilliant depiction of Jason, and you guys, if you want to check out really cool horror-themed art, check out his Instagram page. Check him out. He does commissions, and he's such a brilliant and wonderful and friendly human being. I cannot speak more highly of Mike Hatfield. Am I right?
It's good stuff. It's easy just to do Jason with the mask and all that, but, he said, should I do it with the mask, or is it okay to do it without it? I said, let's... Anytime you can do Jason without the mask, go for it.
And just to shake it up, we have 11 episodes here.
Yeah, exactly, So
and
it's a great unmasked Jason.
If there was ever an episode to have the art be an unmasked Jason, like you just said, I think this is the one.
Good stuff.
Jason's mug in Final Chapter is just terrifying. And it's sort of just burned into my psyche. When I think of Jason, I always picture that face and
he's got the head gash from part 3,
You see the wounds of the past. Yeah, exactly. It's just, it pays homage and tribute to the original Savini design from 1980. So it's it's awesome all the way around. But I just want to say once again, I know we covered it, but I can never say it enough, neither can Joe. We really sincerely love you, and we really sincerely appreciate you, and thank you for sharing your time with us here at Haddonfield Radio and supporting our creativity here at Haddonfield Radio. We are just having the time of our lives doing Season 3. We really hope you guys are enjoying these episodes. If you are, and you have not subscribed, it would really mean the world to us if you could subscribe, if you have enjoyed these episodes. Only so we can keep in touch with you and let you know when new episodes are going to be premiering. You can also check out our Instagram page. We have a really kind of really lively community of fans hanging out there, always with something controversial to say. So the comment section and some of those posts are really fun to look through. So check that out, and that gives you a lot of information about these episodes and when they'll drop and all that. One other thing you could do, if you liked this episode, a very simple thing you can do on your way back out the door, just hit that like button. That really tells us, and more importantly, it tells YouTube that you enjoyed our content and you enjoyed engaging with our content, right?
Yes.
So you may not think that little click is helpful to us, but I promise you it really is. It helps our videos become recommended to other people out there that might be fans of these movies that might want to join this community as well. So anyway, we love you guys so much. We're so thrilled to continue on with season 3. What else? Anything else?
No, yeah, thank you guys.
Yeah.
This has been great.
Next time, of course, for episode 27. I can't believe we're almost 30 episodes in. At episode 27, we are going to be talking about what I think is a very fascinating entry in this franchise. I know a lot of fans throw a little bit of shade at the Fifth Friday for a number of different reasons. Some extremely obvious reasons, some subtle reasons, but there is a lot of shade. But I have a recontextualization of Part 5 that you might find interesting or you might think is ridiculous. But I'll be sharing it with you guys next episode. I think, like I said, it is an incredible bridge between these two distinct eras of Jason Voorhees' story. And I just have this interesting vision and a way I've always sort of looked at Part 5 that I can't wait to share with you guys.
Cool.
Yeah, so we'll be back then next time, episode 27, with Friday the 13th, Part 5, A New Beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what year that was?
I can't say
Yeah, I
off the
can't
top
remember
of my
either.
head.
I'll have to check that out. Probably should have checked that
85, if at the rate that
at the
these
rate
go.
they're going would not
Yeah.
surprise me.
Yeah.
These guys are going like gangbusters. The Mancusos, they got the whip cracking. So anyway,
Yeah.
we love you guys. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for joining us here at Haddonfield Radio for this look at Friday the 13th, the final chapter. It was a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm. I
So,
did. I
yeah.
had a lot of fun.
So yeah, anything else you want to add?
Just kill her, mommy. Kill her.
Killer, mommy, killer. I guess until next time, as always, my name is Christian White.
And I'm Joe Francazio.
Et passez un très joyeux Halloween.
What language is it?
French. That you didn't know that is frightening to me.